Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different, a tale wrapped in silk, shadow, and the faint perfume of forgotten childhoods. Beneath the arches of medieval Damascus, beyond the towering minarets and fragrant spice bazaars, lies a quieter, tender history. One not written in royal decrees or battlefield songs, but in wooden camels, spinning tops, and puppet strings. We're slipping gently into the world of toys. Not the bright plastic kind or the battery-powered kind, but the hand-carved, the sun-faded, the nearly lost to time kind. What did a child love in the 12th century? What did they hide under pillows? What stories swirled around something as simple as a doll's veil, or a toy carved by moonlight for a noble's whispered gift? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just woken up in the velvet shadows of Damascus centuries ago. You stand in a narrow alley of the old city, still cool from the night, lined with wooden shutters and hanging lamps. A sleepy merchant tugs open a canvas flap, revealing a stall not quite like the others. There are no baskets of saffron here, no brass trays or jars of candied lemon. Instead, there are shelves crowded with curious shapes, a lion carved from walnut, a box of pebbles painted in red and blue, a horse no bigger than your palm. This is the toy seller's corner of the market, quiet, overlooked, but full of stories that never made it into the history books. The toys here weren't preserved in great museums. They were meant to be held, broken, kissed, buried in gardens, or lost beneath floorboards. Yet in these trivial shapes are whispers of how children lived, loved, feared. And imagine, you reach out, brushing the flank of a wooden lion. Its mane is a swirl of shallow cuts. The legs are jointed, an early example of articulation, perhaps made to trot across packed sand. Was it a boy's battlefield, a girl's bedside guardian? Historians still argue whether toy animals were purely for play or miniature companions in magical rites. Some even say they were tucked beside the dead as protectors for the afterlife. Next to it, you find a thin reed flute, just 3 holes and a burned inscription along the shaft. The ink has faded, but a single word remains: Nura. Could that be the name of the maker? Or the girl who played it beneath jasmine vines, trying to imitate her father's prayers? A few steps deeper into the stall, and the light changes. Here, under a hanging lantern with a cracked amber glass, lie the older toys, those too delicate for grubby fingers. There's a box of puppets, their strings tangled, their painted faces eerily cheerful. There's something deeply human about them, not just playthings, but tiny performers of adult stories, some whispered, some shouted across courtyards. A velvet trap doll leans against a basket. Her hair is wool, her eyes to uneven beads. Her dress is old, sewn with real threadwork. You'd expect to see her in a bride's lap, maybe learning the rituals of sending veils, of braiding the hair in patterns deemed auspicious for first nights. Some toys were not toys at all, but soft rehearsals for the theater of womanhood. You pick up a small top made from slivers of pressed bone and a reed stalk. Spinning, it hums gently on the stall's wood. These toys were known across the Islamic world, simple, elegant, and sometimes inscribed with talismanic phrases. In Damascus, some had verses from the Quran or Sufi poetry etched along the rim, intended to bring luck or ward off the evil eye as they spun. Were they toys or spinning prayers? There's a gentle melancholy in this corner of the market. So many toys, made for hands that grew up, vanished, or fell in love and forgot them. And yet they remain. Scholars often overlook these fragments, calling them trivial. But think about this. If a child's laughter is the truest voice of a place, then toys are the artifacts of the voice. What a society carves, paints, and gives to its smallest members says more about its soul than even its poetry. You continue through the stall, each item a question. A child's wooden flute, worn smooth at the mouthpiece. A scratched slate with faint chalk lines. a handful of blue glazed beads that once formed a bracelet or a counting toy. Each feels familiar and yet utterly strange. There's a soft clinking sound from behind a faded curtain. The toy maker, perhaps. You catch only a glimpse, a hand carefully sanding a tiny wheel, a sigh through the crack of wood. Toy making, even then, was a craft of intimacy. Some were commissioned one-off pieces for caliph's children, or gifted between would-be lovers under the guise of presents for a niece. There's an old tale, told rarely now, about a merchant's son who fell for a girl above his station. Forbidden to speak to her, he left tiny carved animals on her doorstep each morning. They were dismissed as childish, but each bore a hidden symbol: the lion for courage, the dove for peace, the gazelle for longing. She married another, but kept the toys in a silk pouch till her death. Of course, no one knows if it's true. But that's the thing with toys, they remember more than they let on. A little deeper into the alleys now, and you find yourself guided by sound of faint, dry rattling that echoes gently between the stone walls. It's not the wind, not a stray cat or the ring of a distant minaret. It's something closer, lighter. A toy, perhaps, or several. You follow the sound and soon spot a small woven basket tipped over by a shuttered doorway. Its contents have spilled slightly, half buried beneath dried jasmine petals and the dust of the day. You kneel beside it and discover them. Rattles, small, primitive-looking, but lovingly made. They're fashioned from hollowed bird bones, plugged with soft wax and filled with dry lentils, seeds, or tiny beads of colored glass. Others are carved from wood or shaped from fired clay, etched with animal faces or geometric symbols. You lift one gently and give it the slightest shake. The sound it makes is faint, soothing, less a jingle than a whisper. These weren't just toys. In medieval Damascus, rattles were symbols of comfort, guardians of infancy, and talismans against unseen spirits. Historians believe some were buried beside infants in cradles of pressed wool and linen. They served not just to entertain, but to protect. The rhythmic clatter was thought to confuse or repel the jinn, those mischievous, invisible spirits said to slip through the cracks of the world. One rattle in the basket has been wrapped with a faded ribbon of silk thread dyed with cochineal. Someone, perhaps a mother, once tied it so the rattle could be hung from a cradle beam, bobbing just within reach of a curious baby. And on its side is a name, scratched with the tip of a knife. Yeah. It's easy to imagine the scene: a quiet domestic room scented with rose water, with tapestries fluttering in the breeze and a tiny hand batting at this now silent toy. That child is long gone, but for a moment you hold what he held, and the memory hums faintly through your fingers. One curious rattle is shaped like a tiny amphora, with two handles and a flat bottom. A hole has been pierced through the top, possibly to thread a cord, or perhaps part of a ritual. There's ongoing debate among scholars about these unusually shaped rattles. Some suggest they doubled as early feeding vessels. Others believe they were made for ceremonial gifting during circumcision feasts or naming ceremonies. And then there are the whispered theories, less accepted, but quietly passed along in Damascus. Folklore that certain rattles were used in fertility charms, not for the baby, but the parents. These would be left on a pillow or nestled into the folds of a bride's trousseau, meant to welcome joy into the private chambers. The euphemisms abound, of course, but the intention, it seems, was both innocent and softly sensual. Joy begets joy. In the corner of the basket lies an oddly shaped item, rough, unpainted, with the remnants of a red string tied around its neck. At first glance it seems like nothing, but in the archives of the Umayyad Mosque, there are records of such objects being given to temple attendants' children. They were sometimes blessed and dipped in perfumed oil. Perhaps this one was a gift of protection, then play. Next to the rattles, nestled in a piece of folded cloth, are the tiny sandals hardly longer than a thumb, play shoes, made for a doll, or perhaps part of a child's game, imitating adults. One sandal still bears a stain from pomegranate juice, and its sole has been etched with patterns so delicate you'd think they were tattooed. Play was never just play. These tiny objects remind you that every toy is also a story. a clue to what mattered, a rehearsal for what was expected. You remember the old saying from a 12th century Damascus manual on child rearing: the child mimics the father in wood before he mimics him in work. That same manuscript included sketches of toys, lists of which ones were considered noble or vulgar, and curious advice on which games were befitting of a daughter meant for an honorable marriage. It's a strange line to walk between nurturing and instruction. But for medieval parents, toys were often tools of preparation. The noble child received a toy abacus and lion figurines. The merchant's child played with counting stones and pots. The seamstress's daughter practiced braiding on dolls with waxed hair. And yet, even in these differences, all children shared the same magic, the joy of pretend. There is an often cited folktale in the oral tradition of Damascus about a boy named Musa who believed his clay rattle could summon angels. Every evening, before sleep, he would shake it 3 times, and in his dreams, winged figures would lead him through gardens of sugar and fountains of milk. One day, he dropped it in the well. He wept for weeks. Then, years later, his daughter found the toy buried in the courtyard and asked, "Papa, do angels still listen to this? Is it true?" Probably not. But isn't it lovely? As the sun rises a little higher and the alley warms, you place the rattle gently back into the basket. A woman nearby, old and dressed in layers of dove-gray linen, nods at you knowingly. She gestures to your palm and says, softly, "They remember more than we do." And indeed, they do. The alley curves gently eastward, its walls narrowing until even your footsteps soften to a whisper. Here, the light grows golden, filtered through lattice work and faded silks fluttering above like improvise. The canopies, and just ahead, a little stage, not grand, not even formal, just a wooden platform, barely a few handspans high, surrounded by cushions and shaded by a sagging fig tree. This is where the marionettes once danced. It isn't a theater in the traditional sense. No velvet curtains, no tickets, no orchestras. Just a low box with painted backdrops, a faded rug for the storyteller, and the scent of cardamom still lingering in the air. And above it, suspended by threads so fine you'd think them spawned from air itself, a tangle of puppets, long-limbed, painted, expressive. Their faces are curious, not grotesque, not comic, but watchful. Puppet shows in medieval Damascus weren't merely children's amusements. They were the street's cleverest mirrors reflecting satire, politics, moral lessons, and yes, even romance. Puppeteers often from modest backgrounds were sharp observers, and the puppets, they said what no adult dared. You settled down beside a carved box filled with puppets awaiting their curtain call. A lion with a painted crown, a veiled woman with articulated wrists, a scholar with an oversized turban, his eyes wide with theatrical wisdom. These characters returned night after night, becoming familiar to audiences who knew when to laugh and when to sigh. But not all the stories were innocent, and one preserved script hand-copied and smuggled across centuries. A marionette named Halima seduces a nobleman using only gestures, no words, just the sway of her hips, the flutter of her fan, and a carefully timed lowering of her painted eyes. The performance ends not with a kiss, but with Halima vanishing into a cloud of perfume. It sounds risque, but it wasn't crude. These were parables in silk, adult themes veiled in puppet form, flirtation, betrayal, longing, all softened by strings and stylized movement. Nothing explicit, just suggestion, nuance, and perfume-soaked metaphor. Historians still argue whether puppet shows of this kind were accepted public art or tolerated subversion. Some believe they were sanctioned by the ruling class as a release valve, a way for people to laugh at what they couldn't change. Others argue they were constantly shut down, only to reappear days later under new names. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. Children, of course, saw a different story. For them, these figures were heroes, tricksters, dancers. Some would go home and tie thread to bits of cloth and play out the scenes on their own rooftop. A girl might practice Halima's elegant wave, dreaming not of seduction, but of becoming the star. A boy might mimic the lion's royal roar, not out of rebellion, but for the thrill of pretend power. And somewhere, beneath all that performance, the real city pulsed. You pick up one puppet, its strings tangled like hair after sleep. It's a jester, with a sly grin and bells missing from his cap. A storyteller's puppet. His role, supposedly, was to close every play with a riddle or a rhyme. One surviving poem attributed to him reads, "He who laughs loudest hides longest the ache. He who pulls strings feels the threads that break." What child understood those lines? Probably none. But they were repeated anyway, passed down like lullabies or riddles with meanings that only age could unlock. To the side of the stage, there's a crate of props, miniature goblets, cloth veils, and even a tiny lute. These items help build the worlds of the puppet stage palaces and gardens, temples and bathhouses. The puppets had private chambers, tiny silk canopies, painted screens, love scenes unfolded in moonlight, battles at dusk, betrayals behind perfumed curtains. The bathhouse scenes were always a favorite, not scandalous, but cheeky, poking fun at etiquette, poking fun at vanity. Puppets would slip, peek, scold. Steam was represented with fluttering gauze. You can almost hear the laughter now soft, bubbling, innocent and impish all at once. Older citizens would gather just as eagerly as the young. For them, the puppets spoke old truths with new faces. They would nudge each other during political jabs, sigh knowingly when a puppet bride scolded her lazy husband, and whisper barely concealed commentary when a scene mimicked real-life gossip. One puppet, a scholar with painted glasses and two long arms, was said to be modeled on an actual imam who opposed puppet shows as distracting temptations. Naturally, he was the audience's favorite, and one of the puppeteers. They were respected, but marginal, often nomadic, sometimes feared as sorcerers of performance. They knew how to make puppets breathe, how to time a shoulder drop just so, how to make a lover's farewell seem unbearably sweet with nothing more than a turning wrist. One legend says a famous puppeteer refused all marriage proposals because she was already married to her strings. Another tale claims a puppet once blinked without its master touching it, causing half the audience to gasp and the other half to whisper of gin. The strings dangle softly above you now. No show today, just the echoes, just the scent of old cedar and the hush of waiting characters. You reach up, give the lion's paw the slightest tug. It sways gently. It remembers. You sit back against the warm wall, eyes half-lidded, the world fading just a little. Even the puppets, in their slumped silence, seem to rest now. Their drama suspended, their strings untugged. Let them sleep too. You leave the shadow of the marionette stage and step into a courtyard bathed in late morning light. The air is thick with the scent of crushed mint, spilled ink, and sun-warmed clay. A row of old satchels lines the wall beside a worn bench. These weren't merely pretty stones. They were tools of amusement, symbols in child-made worlds, and children. They mimic both examples. And sometimes, if the rumors are true, wagers in quiet, unsupervised games where stakes were more than marbles. Another more curious version had children assigning meanings to the colors and creating storytelling challenges. If you drew a red pebble, you had to invent a tale of heartbreak. A blue, a sea journey. A green, out tumbled more tokens. One shaped like a tiny amphora, another like a crescent moon. The game's name is lost, but versions of it appear in Islamic manuscripts from Baghdad to Cairo. Players moved pieces by reciting poetic clues, their understanding of metaphor as critical as their tactical skill, symbolic play, or just idle carving. Perhaps both. Something scandalous, usually a misunderstood, overheard conversation between adults. She wins again. It reads, and he pretends not to mind. A sister, a cousin, a mother watching her son lose on purpose to keep the game going just a little longer. Childhood, affection in its earliest, most poetic form. Some scholars claim it's irrelevant, but for those who know how to read between the ink stains, it's a love story in miniature. Unrolling it reveals a list, childishly written. Could this be the same child, or simply the name most mothers adored that year. Some words are faded, but the last few stand out. Things to bring: pebbles, dice, red string. Nira's lucky charm. Play is a form of devotion, hidden in laughter. The stakes were privileges. Who would light the evening lamp? Who would fetch water? Who would wear the crown of woven reeds until sunset? The reed crown, it's said, was sometimes scented with clove oil, a symbol of good fortune and mild vanity. In Damascus, charms were everywhere, from grown-up amulets to child-made talismans of ribbon and bone. Some children tied bits of string around their toys for luck. Others whispered names to the wind before a throw of the dice. The courtyard is silent now, but the echo of voices remains, teasing, rhyming, promising, unless you're too afraid to lose your crown again. The line between game and magic was never clearly drawn. An innocent honor, unless it stirred jealous glances from across the room. Small hands once carried these pouches that held more than parchment or bread. One popular challenge involved reciting verses while keeping a pebble balanced on one's head and early. Laughable form of posture training. You kneel beside one and gently untie its faded cord. Inside, the soft clink of something unexpected. Dice, carved from bone and smoothed by time. Each side etched with calligraphic numerals, uneven yet elegant. The wear on the corners suggests heavy use not in scholarly equations, but in games played under fig trees and behind school walls. Alongside the dice are painted pebbles, each roughly the size of a fingertip, dyed in muted reds, dusty blues, and olive greens. A symbol etched into its face, a rose, delicately stylized, the symbol of longing. Its corners are slightly burnt, as if once used in a ritual, or maybe dropped too close to a lantern's flame. You turn it over. The back is blank. Game playing in medieval Damascus straddled a delicate line. It was encouraged for moral learning, fairness, patience, strategy, but condemned if it veered toward gambling. One game involved tossing the stones into chalk-drawn rings. Much like jacks or early forms of hopscotch, soft games of improvisation, where truth slipped out in pretend form. Scholars remain divided on the origins of these painted stones. Some believe they evolved from Roman and Byzantine practices of storytelling through tokens. Others argue they were a local invention, born from idle afternoons and market refuse. One theory suggests they were fragments of broken ceramic charms, repurposed by inventive children. Another insists they were tied to training, memory, and rhetoric. There's no consensus, only fragments. You shake the satchel gently to one side of the courtyard. An older boy once etched a simple grid into the ground, still faintly visible beneath the dirt. Game board, perhaps. Children were taught poetry as young as 6, so it's no surprise their games were infused with rhyme, allusion, and layered meaning. And yes, there were wagers, but not in money. Romance, even in childhood, sometimes slipped in softly. There is a mention in an old market log, an offhand note about a boy who kept losing to the same girl every afternoon near the scribe's school. You look up at the windows overhead, imagining curious faces peeking down. By your side lies a tiny carved tile ivory, or perhaps camel bone. Another mystery, another whisper of a game whose rules we no longer understand. As you sit back on your heels, you spot something tucked beneath the bench. A roll of parchment, chewed slightly at the corner, as if by a dog or a curious sibling. That name again, Nura, from the reed flute in the toy seller's stall. Either way, the mention of a lucky charm piques your interest. In fact, some scholars argue that many of these games were covert spiritual exercises, practices passed from grandmother to child to reinforce rhythms, memory, and presence. You drop the pebbles back into the satchel and ready the cord, giving it one last pat. Your turn, one voice might say. You leave the quiet courtyard and its scattered pebbles behind, stepping into a narrow breezeway lined with spice jars and beeswax candles. At first, it seems like just another passage to the main soup, but something draws you left toward a stall that no longer sells anything edible. Instead, nestled behind his arched wooden counter are shapes that glimmer faintly in the warm light, shapes that are at once whimsical and fleeting. They are toys, yes, but edible ones. Here rest the remnants of a forgotten tradition in medieval Damascus: sugar statues and honey. Animals, long before icing and candy molds became commonplace. Confectioners would sculpt little figures from thickened syrup, boiled honey, or cane sugar brought through trade routes from Egypt or Yemen. These sugary creatures were crafted as gifts, festival novelties, or rewards. Some were playthings of only for an hour. Others were made to vanish, deliberately, by melting on the tongue. You pick up one of the hardened molds, a tiny lion with paws tucked under its belly, its face wide-eyed and oddly noble. The detail is astonishing: claws, whiskers, a carefully swirled mane. The craftsmanship, for something so temporary, borders on reverent. Scholars believe these sugar figurines were especially popular during Mawlid, prophets' birthday celebrations, or on Eid mornings, when children awoke to gifts laid beside their pillows, not coins or trinkets, but sweet animals or delicate sugar flowers wrapped in silk paper. And yet, for some families, especially the wealthier ones, these figures held more symbolic meaning. One particularly curious recipe found in a Damascene household manual lists rose-scented lions, sculpted as tokens of male birth. When a boy was born, the mother as family might send honey-carved lions to the father as house sweets to be eaten by guests, and a message sweetly encoded in form. Girls, on the other hand, were often gifted sugar doves, soft, winged things, gentle, pure. Historians still debate whether this distinction had deeper meaning, or was simply a poetic indulgence. Was it gendered sweetness, or just culinary artistry at play? The question lingers like the last traces of honey on the tongue. You run your fingers along a small tray filled with crumbled remnants, what might have once been fish, birds, or even tiny thrones. The fish, some believed, symbolized abundance and fertility, and when molded into sweet form, they became humorous little gifts in games of courtship. One tale, more whispered than written, tells of a young bakeress apprentice who fashioned a sugar nightingale and presented it to a bookseller as daughter during Ramadan. She accepted it, but said nothing. The next day, she returned with a sugar cat. 2 days later, he gave her a sugar cage. The final night of the month, she brought him a sugar key. Playful? Yes, but also layered with implication. These were edible love letters. Of course, such tales rarely ended in marriage. But that wasn't the point. These exchanges were not always about outcomes. They were about permission to speak, to flirt, to dream. And sugar, in those days, was more than indulgence. It was luxury. It was intention. Some sugar toys were even perfumed. You read that correctly scented with rose, orange blossom, or musk. They were pressed into molds while still soft, dusted with powdered sugar, then wrapped in linen to keep their scent sealed. Children would breathe them in before biting. Some held them near while they slept, then woke with sticky fingers and half-melted lions. More than a few adult poets wrote nostalgic verses about such toys. One Sufi mystic, when asked what he remembered most of childhood, wrote simply, "The honey horse that melted too soon." And not all these treats were made at home. In fact, one specific quarter of Damascus was famous for its confectionery artisans, many of whom moonlighted as toy makers during seasonal festivals. They worked from dusk till dawn, kneading honey and stretching sugar by hand, using copper tools worn smooth by decades. These craftsmen, called Halloween, were also responsible for another kind of magic: the spinning. Sugar sculptures. These were ephemeral masterpieces, sugar whirled and pulled into the shapes of fountains, crescents, or elaborate palaces, then gently hardened and displayed. Some were commissioned by nobles, others bought in halves or quarters by eager children pulling coins together. And here lies the quiet tragedy of these toys. They were too beautiful to last. A slight breeze, a hot afternoon, or a greedy sibling, and they were gone. Historians often complain that there are no good examples left of these edible marvels. But of course there aren't. That was the point. They weren't meant to last. They were sweetness distilled into shape, into memory, then devoured or destroyed. You find one surviving mold. Beneath the stallless cloth cover, a crescent moon with stars cut into the curve, still faintly dusted with clove powder. Its use is clear. This was an eyed tree perhaps made by a grandmother for her grandchildren, or a shy apprentice trying to impress her mentor with flavor as much as form. And just beside it, almost missed, lies something even rarer, a scroll, brown and crisp, tied with what used to be a licorice root. C or D. You unroll it carefully. The ink is faint, but legible. It's a list of forms most requested. Feast of the Moon, year 587 lion. Full maned dove with almond eyes fish. Striped cat with curled tail, key cage baby with open eyes. That last entry is curious. A sugar baby? Was it a charm? A symbol? Some believe such sweets were used in fertility ceremonies or given to expectant mothers. Others argue it was simply a popular shape that children liked to cradle. Before it disappeared between their teeth, you fold the scroll and replace it. You've tasted none of these, yet you feel sated, as if you licked syrup from a spoon. The stall is quiet again. The honey toys are gone now, melted away by centuries, but their sweetness lingers in the folds of your imagination, clinging like syrup to your thoughts. Just past the honey stall, you follow the soft scuff of your sandals down a long colonnade where the walls are painted in faded mosaic palms, peacocks, curling vines. A cooling breeze drifts through, and you soon find yourself in a school courtyard. Not a formal madrasa, no stern-faced scholars today. This is something smaller, quieter. A place where chalk dust still hangs faintly in the air. In one corner rests a low wooden bench, its surface grooved with years of scribbles. Beneath it, a small pile of boards, slates coated with wax, and beside them, trays filled with fine river sand. You brush your fingers over one tray, disturbing the surface, and feel the soft drag of silt beneath your nails. These are the sand scribe's toys, teaching tools, yes, but also gateways to play, imagination, and mischief. Children in medieval Damascus often learned their first letters by drawing them in sand. With sticks or fingers, sand trays allowed repetition without waste. A mistake. Simply smooth it over and begin again. For young students, this made learning tactile, soothing, even meditative. But it also invited a certain creative interpretation. Because where there's sand and a moment without supervision, there are not just letters being drawn but ships, cats, battle scenes, and occasionally, yes, naughty little doodles passed off as abstract when teachers walked by. One surviving sand tablet, now stored in a private Damascus archive, contains faint impressions of what appears to be a man chasing a chicken, both smiling for reasons unclear. Beneath them are letters, half-formed and wandering. Someone was practicing, and someone was playing. Scholars still debate how formal this kind of early writing training really was. Some argue it was strict, rhythmically chanted, led by firm-voiced tutors who accepted no nonsense. Others believe that in domestic settings, especially among literate families, writing was taught with more tenderness and often more humor. It likely varied, of course, but many descriptions suggest that children often learned alongside cousins or siblings, sprawled on carpets, their slates beside them, while older relatives brewed tea or sorted spices in the background. The line between lesson and play was gentle, porous. One of the most curious finds in recent years was a wax board unearthed during renovations of an old hammam. It contained practice lines, Arabic letters etched clumsily but also tucked in the margins. A tiny sketch of a woman with extravagant hair and exaggerated features. She's labeled teacher, though the tone may not have been entirely respectful. Another wax board bore a more poetic scrawl. He who knows the word for love cannot forget it, even in wax. Was it a line from a poem, a boy's joke, or something else? Indeed, wax boards themselves weren't just educational tools, they were common gifts for children from middle-class families. Some were beautifully crafted, their wooden frames inlaid with geometric motifs or mother of pearl. A few came with custom inscriptions along the edge, blessings, reminders, or even soft little commands like write what pleases God. But the children wrote more than prayers. They wrote questions. They drew maps of imaginary cities. They played mock court, drawing verdicts and fake charges. In one playful exercise described in a teacher's diary, children had to sentence imaginary thieves, drawing both their crimes and their punishments, some realistic, some absurd. One student wrote, "He stole my sister's doll. His punishment is to marry a frog." The teacher, apparently, approved. Beyond sand and wax, it came later. Expensive, rare, guarded. But some children practice with brushes and thin dye. Their fingers stained the same blue as the tiles on their school's walls. And just like the pebbles and dice in the previous courtyard, these tools carried symbolic power. A boy who learned to write was seen as a future clerk, merchant, or judge. A girl who practiced her calligraphy well might be praised as refined, graceful, even suitable for poetry or teaching. One lesser-known tradition involved girls composing mirror poems, lines written in sand or wax, and then immediately erased after reading aloud. These were private thoughts, glimpses of emotion shared only once, never repeated. The words were not meant to survive, only to be spoken, heard, and released. A kind of ephemeral confession, done with a giggle or a sigh. The sand remembers nothing, and that is what made it perfect. There's an old saying attributed to a Damascene teacher of the 12th century. What is written in ink may be judged. What is written in sand is for the heart alone. Beautiful, melancholy, and very, very human. Back in the courtyard, you find a reed stylus tucked behind a clay jar. It's barely longer than your finger. Smooth from use, the point is worn, but still serviceable. Perhaps this was the tool of a left-handed child, its angle suggests an odd grip, or perhaps it was used not to write, but to poke, to prod, to sketch a line between friends sitting side by side on the tile floor. One tray, still covered with sand, holds a few idle shapes, a crescent, a flower, and what might be an arrow pointing toward the sunlit doorway. You smile. Someone passed through here just recently, or perhaps long ago, and the patterns held themselves intact, like memories that refuse to fade. You give the tray the gentlest shake, the surface smooths. Blank once more, a clean slate, waiting. Beyond the school courtyard lies a narrow garden, flanked by low walls and overhanging orange trees. The wind carries a faint perfumed citrus peel, crushed marjoram, and the floral trace of something older, dustier. A cluster of children's voices once echoed here, but they've long since faded, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves brushing the stone. You step between the planters, following faint footprints in the dust. Near a shaded alcove, a curious structure leans against the wall. It's a simple frame, wooden and worn, strung with faded threads that once formed a lattice. It's a loom, but not for tapestries or robes. This one is child-sized and clearly, lovingly used. You're in the play-weaving garden. In medieval Damascus, textile work was everywhere. Cloth was not merely commodity, it was identity. Silk, wool, cotton, linen all marked who you were, what you did, even what you dreamed of. And from a young age, children learned to imitate the world. But their cloth wasn't for trade, it was for stories. These small looms, set up in private gardens or shaded balconies, allowed children, especially girls, though not only them, to weave pretend cloth for dolls, animals, or small ceremonies of their own making. Ribbons for puppet brides, shawls for sugar lions, veils for dolls carved by uncles and older brothers. The practice wasn't idle mimicry, it was training, but it was also pleasure. One surviving letter, written by a Damascene merchant to his sister, praises his young niece for sending him a miniature rug woven in 6 shades and full of dreams. It's unlikely the girl knew she just charmed a trader into sending her rose jam. And stories from Aleppo. There is scholarly debate about whether these looms were common in all households, or a luxury confined to merchant and scholarly classes. Some evidence, like worn heddles found in the poorer districts, suggests they were more widespread than we assume. Children, after all, don't need wealth to want to imitate beauty. You kneel beside the child's loom. A few old threads remain, some tangled, some cut. The pattern isn't clear, but there's the suggestion of stripes alternating light and dark, perhaps once dyed with saffron or walnut husk. You imagine small fingers threading a shuttle back and forth, tongue tucked at the corner of the mouth in concentration. This kind of weaving wasn't just for fun. Some believed it had protective powers. A popular belief in 12th century Damascus held that a girl's first woven cloth, if tied with a blue thread and tucked into the beams of the home, would bless her future household. For boys, a single thread from their weaving was sometimes braided into the cord of their writing pouch, a mix of metaphor and magical thinking, a union of cloth and intellect. Weaving also played in the dreams. One mother's notebook, preserved remarkably well in a family archive, contains a short instruction: let her weave before dawn. If the thread does not break, the wish may be kept. A soft superstition or ritual passed from older women to their daughters like a whispered lullaby. And the wishes? Always simple: a friend's health, a sweeter fig harvest, a secret hope for a cousin to return from the northern provinces before spring, or less often voiced, but always present, the wish to be noticed, adored, or allowed to choose love over arrangement. Yes, even here, in the child's weaving garden, matters of the heart began to bud. A doll's veil, after all, is never just fabric. It is a rehearsal, a signal, an echo of what the child watches the women do, sending fabric with oils, braiding silks, exchanging glances through embroidery. One worn piece of linen nearby is edged with what looks like clumsy needlework, zigzags, loops, and one long trailing line that ends in the shape of a heart. It's faint, almost accidental, but it's there. Some looms also doubled as game boards. Children would drape their weaving, then use the lines of thread as territories and imagine wars between painted pebble armies or traveling merchants. One such game was called Caught Al Matter, the line of rain. It involved moving tiny wooden tokens from one side of the weaving to the other, trying to cross without wetting the cloth. The rules were vague and changed often, but the joy was real. Some children even wrote poems about their weaving. In one preserved school notebook, a girl named Samira wrote, "The thread is soft, but sharper than scolding. It holds the whisper, tighter than silence." She would have been 9, maybe 10. We don't know if she ever wrote again, but her lines outlived her. Nearby, you find a basket of plant fibers, reeds, scraps of wool, a curl of faded indigo cotton. Someone was mid-project, long ago, and now you wonder if perhaps the little loom was used not just for cloth, but for secrets, a gift being made in silence, or a message, hidden in color, for someone too shy to speak aloud. There are legends, soft and unverified, of children who wove names into their cloths and buried them under fig trees, believing the earth would carry the name to the stars. Others believe in night weaving, setting up a frame after sunset and working until sleep overtook them. In dreams, they said, the threads would reveal answers. The wind stirs the orange leaves overhead. One petal drops into the loom, resting gently on the remaining thread. A flower for the final row. You leave it there. You wander deeper into the orchard gardens, where pomegranate trees lean heavy with fruit, and the ground beneath your feet shifts from worn stone to tamped earth. Here, the city's rhythm softens, hushed by a thicket of lavender and fennel. And just beyond the hedge, you see it, a sunken circle lined with stones, no wider than a bed. Not a fountain, not a hearth, something stranger. This is the dust arena, a ring of packed soil where children once gathered to spin tops, not just any tops, but elaborately balanced, colorfully adorned, and sometimes whispered about objects of great pride. You step closer and notice faint carvings on the inner stones. Names, symbols, even scores. A child's history book, written not with ink, but with a scrape of determination. In one crevice, someone scratched what appears to be a bird mid-flight. In another, a delicate spiral, perhaps a diagram for spinning. Angles, Tops, or duarat, were more than idle toys. In medieval Damascus, they were crafted with care and precision, spun not only for fun, but in open-air competitions that blended skill, strategy, and a touch of youthful pageantry. Some were fashioned from hardwoods, smoothed with beeswax, and weighted with tiny stones embedded in the base. Others, more modest, were carved from fruit pits or clay and painted with crushed berries and saffron wash. A well-made top could spin for nearly a minute a lifetime. By child reckoning, you kneel to inspect the center of the ring. The soil is still slightly indented, as if it remembers the endless rounds played here. You find a shard of painted wood, a fragment from a one-sprout spinner. It's streaked with blue dye, and you wonder whose hand once wound the string tight around its neck before launching it into battle. Spinning was often accompanied by chant verses shouted or sung by the players to distract opponents, or bless their own top with rhythm. One preserved chant, still sung today in Damascus back streets during Eid, goes, "Spin, spin, and strike the sun. The boy who loses has to run." Mildly threatening, charmingly silly. But underneath, a deeper tradition. Many scholars believe these tops were part of more than just games. They were tools of initiation used to test a child's hand, focus, and pride. The contests often unfolded with older children as judges, choosing who would spin first, who had the noble string, and who must fetch the runaway top when it spun too far. Sometimes there were prizes, dried apricots, a fig, or the right to wear a sash made of garden twine for the day. Tales persist of girls winning such contests and being sung about for weeks afterward. One particularly famous case involves a merchant's daughter named Layla, who, according to a parchment note in a private diary, spun a carved cedar top that knocked her rivals clean out of the ring. The next morning, he arrived at her gate with a lemon blossom and no top to offer. No one knows if she took it, but she did keep spinning. The craft of top making was an art in itself. Children were often taught by older siblings or neighbors, using simple knives and scraps of leftover wood. Some added metal tacks for weight, others inserted beads to create a soft ringing sound mid-spin. There were even whisperings, playful and half-believed, of talking tops, which would sing or buzz certain sounds depending on how they were thrown. One top, found in a marketplace excavation, has a hollow chamber carved inside, perhaps meant to whistle as it spun, a playful toy, or the work of an early genius. Historians are still unsure. And not all tops were benign. A few boys carved tops with pointed ends, meant not for beauty, but for war duels fought in miniature, where each top struck the other in rapid succession. These battles, called duarat al-nazal, spinning clashes, were sometimes frowned upon by teachers, who preferred peaceful play. But among the children, they were legendary. Some players believed a top should be blessed before the match brushed with the tail of a cat, or held under the moonlight. Others kept small charms tied around the wrist while spinning, or whispered the name of a favorite cousin for luck. One enduring tradition, still remembered in old Damascene families, involved burying a favorite top when its edge broke beyond repair. It was a child's funeral rite performed in quiet ceremony, sometimes with soft words spoken. "May your spin return in my next life." Perhaps dramatic, perhaps sincere, perhaps both. You reach into the soil, brushing gently beneath the surface, and find another piece, a string, brittle now, but once tied tight around a spinning toy. You close your hand around it, and it feels like holding a breath from long ago, light, frayed, yet still holding tension. There are no children in the arena today, no chance, no contests, just you, the earth, and the memory of 100 games played with delight and fierce, wild focus. You can almost hear the soft collision of the tops mid-spin, the burst of cheers, the thud of someone's sandals racing after a runaway. One stone in the ring has a phrase carved faintly along its edge, half buried by time. Round and round. The heart does spin, slower now, but just as deep. You stay a little longer, watching the wind stir the dust in tiny circles, Not a game this time, but a whisper, still spinning. The dust arena fades behind you as you follow a vine-covered archway toward the scent of warm milk and spiced clove. A breeze flutters past, catching at your sleeve, tugging you toward a shaded nook tucked between the older buildings. Here, the walls are lined with faded tiles bright once, now softened with time man beneath them. Rows of smooth shelves, barely knee-height. You stepped into what was once a doll bazaar. Not a true marketplace, but a pretend one. A miniature suit crafted by children and kept in the care of their older sisters, or neighborhood aunties who had the patience and the poetry to keep it going. The shelves are still dotted with traces of their former occupants, tiny pottery jugs no bigger than your thumb, a lace scrap folded into a dress, a clay bowl painted with uneven swirls of gold. Some of these were likely shaped by hand, others gifted by amused adults or repurposed from broken housewares. All of them, however, were parts of elaborate, make-believe lives. You sit on a low stool and peer inside one of the shelves. There's the remnant of a tiny pillow stuffed with lavender. Its scent barely there, but unmistakable. This was no crude corner of childish nonsense. This was a place of delicate rituals, of imagined commerce, of whispered dramas involving toy households and long-suffering figurine husbands who forgot anniversaries made up 10 minutes earlier. Dolls in medieval Damascus weren't always the soft, stitched kind. In fact, many were made of wood, clay, or even hard bread sculpted in the shape and then dried in the sun. Limbs didn't always move. Faces were painted or scratched on with care. And clothing, that was where the real artistry flourished. Tiny veils, miniature caftans, even scaled down. Jewelry made from bits of wire or stone. Some dolls had hair made of frayed twine or silk, and one rare specimen found in a private home archive was discovered wearing a ring of real gold thread likely unraveled from an adult's embroidery. Stashed out, these dolls weren't merely playthings. They were tools of social rehearsal. Girls and sometimes boys used them to act out weddings, market visits, birth celebrations, and even private sorrows. A doll might become a bride, or a midwife, or a grandmother hired to cook. One documented game involved a courtship scenario in which dolls passed letters between homes. The content of the letters, folded scraps of real poetry, borrowed from adults' bookshelves or overheard in whispered conversations, of course. Dolls also served quieter roles, one fringe belief, preserved in a strange little side note and a physician's manual, suggested that sleeping beside a doll scented with rosewater and tucked under the right arm could ward off dreams of unfit longing. Another tale tells of a young girl who refused to sleep without her doll of secrets, what she swore could listen and never tell. Historians argue whether these dolls reflected cultural norms or quietly challenged them. Were they tools to reinforce obedience, tradition, and expectation, or were they tiny escapes, allowing children, especially girls, to rewrite the stories that adulthood seemed to hold for them? Perhaps they were both. In the same way a bedtime tale can be both soothing and subversive, these dolls carried many truths. There are records, though rare, of women who kept their childhood dolls well into adulthood. One merchant's wife reportedly kept her first mother doll wrapped in silk beneath her writing desk, using it as a kind of muse. Another noblewoman commissioned a jeweler to craft miniature earrings for the doll she'd had since age 7, sparking gossip, but also admiration for her dedication. You open a small drawer near your foot. Inside, nestled on a scrap of muslin, is the head of a doll carved from ivory, cracked down one cheek, its eyes painted with dark kohl. The lips are shaped into the faintest of smiles, and the hole at the neck suggests it once sat on a movable, bodied a rare example, an expensive one, possibly a gift, possibly a treasure. There's a note, too, smudged and faint, written in a child's careful Arabic. She forgave him. She always does. Tomorrow she will wear the blue again. What was the story? Was it a puppet courtship played too many times? or the echo of an overheard family argument reimagined in miniature play. After all, has always been how children digest the world. These dolls became vessels not just of imagination, but of interpretation. A mirror, yes, but one that sometimes softened what it reflected. One older tradition, barely mentioned in the formal histories, tells of girls who held small, candlelit wedding feasts for their dolls. They would dress them in white, offer drops of honey on rice paper, and chant verses borrowed from real ceremonies. Some even braided their own hair into tiny locks for their doll's wedding veil, believing it would bind the toy bride's luck to their own. Not all dolls were brides, of course. Some were warriors, some scholars, some simply companions. But many were made to love, to mourn, and to forgive. And that, in its way, may be the most enduring lesson. You trace your fingers along the edge of a shelf where someone once carved 3 names: Amal, Yasmina, Nur, perhaps the bazaar's founders, perhaps sisters, or a trio of friends who passed. The stall down, generation to generation, along with its little dramas. In the far corner of the nook lies a tiny cone, no bigger than a matchstick, carved from bone. You lift it gently. A doll's accessory, yes, but you can picture a child pretending to untangle long, silken hair, murmuring apologies for the knots, humming lullabies in between strokes. Some say that toys are fleeting, but this little comb, in your hand now, says otherwise. It carries memory in its teeth. You leave the doll bazaar with a quiet smile and follow the curving path past a half-cracked archway, draped in trumpet vine. On the other side, laughter once echoed beneath linen awnings now gone to wind and time. The ground here is littered with wooden pegs and faded strings, some tied in haphazard loops. Others knotted with great purpose. You've arrived at the kite court, though it lacks walls. This open clearing was sacred in its own way, a space where children sent their joys, questions, and tiny rebellions skyward. The Damascus kite kayora was a marvel of ingenuity, often crafted with paper-thin reed frames and dyed fabric or oiled parchment stretched tight. Children constructed them in secret corners or busy courtyards, dipping their brushes in ground pigments, adding flourishes of birds, suns, or cryptic symbols borrowed from their parents' books or marketplaces. One fragment found tucked in the corner of a merchant's roof still bears a painted inscription: "Let the wind carry what I cannot say." Flying a kite was no mere pastime. In medieval Damascus, it was an art form, a performance, and on occasion a form of coded defiance. Historians still debate the origins of the city's kite obsession. Some trace it to imported Chinese designs, brought through trade. Others insist it was a natural evolution of banner-making traditions mixed with storytelling impulses. Whatever the truth, by the 12th century, children in Damascus were flying kites not just for fun, but to communicate. Across rooftops, one popular kite style had a long tail made of silk scraps, each segment stitched with a word or name. These were called kite al-nam, sleep strings, and were said to hold a wish, often romantic or deeply private, sent into the sky before bedtime. You pick up one such tail now, faded to threads. There's only one visible word left: Hadia, a name, a gift, or both. Some of these kite tails were burned ceremonially at sunset, especially if the wish was deemed fulfilled or hopeless. Others were folded and hidden in pillowcases, as if sleeping with them might make the sky listen twice. And oh, the kite duels. Boys and more than a few girls would coat their kite strings in ground glass mixed with glue, then compete in rooftop cuts. The goal: sever your opponent's string midair. The loser's kite would drift away, and whoever caught it on the ground became its new owner. These battles were thrilling, sometimes forbidden, always riddled with flair. There's one legendary tale, half-myth, perhaps of a girl named Ruqayya, who won 3 kite battles in 1 week during Ramadan, flying a red and gold hawk-shaped kite, stitched with a single word: freedom. She was banned from competing after that, but the kite appeared again years later, flown by another girl who claimed she had found it tied to a palm tree. with a jasmine garland. Whether that's true or not, it speaks to the way these toys weren't just about wind and paper. They were about legacy. And then there were the kites of silence, made with muted fabrics, browns, grays, soft indigo, and no designs at all. These were flown at twilight by children in mourning. The story goes that if you whispered a name 3 times into the kite's frame before launch, it would reach the stars and find its way to the departed. Some children believed these silent kites would circle once overhead before heading west, toward the setting sun, a private ritual, a grief barely veiled. Of course, not all flights were so heavy. Many kites were made simply for joy triangles, with smiling faces, box kites that rattled as they turned, fish shapes that dipped like they swam in the sky. Parents sometimes join in, especially fathers on festival days, helping attach longer tails or adjust the balance with little pebbles. One preserved painting from the 13th century shows a boy and girl chasing a tumbling kite together. Their shadows stretch long on the roof tiles. The boy's hand is outstretched. The girl's braid whips behind her in the wind, their faces almost comically serious. Even older teenagers didn't always outgrow the tradition. Some turned to message kites, small paper slips tied to the tail or belly of the toy, sent drifting to another rooftop or window. Love notes, jokes, dares, and once a mock marriage proposal delivered by air. The recipient accepted by flying a kite with a green ribbon the next day. One mother, in a preserved diary fragment, lamented, "The roof is not safe. Every kite might carry a poem, and I cannot watch the sky all day." In your hand now is the broken spine of a collapsed kite. The bamboo is brittle, the fabric long gone, but the shape remains, the promise of lift, of upward motion, of playful rebellion against gravity's grip. And across the ground, more strings, some tangled, some trailing into the hedges. A few are knotted into patterns, braids, loops, even little words in cursive Arabic. One spells out as a B or dash patience. Maybe that was a child's reminder to wait for the right wind, or maybe it was something else entirely. Some children use broken kite strings as bracelets, wrapping them around the wrist 3 times for luck. Others believe they could predict the next day's weather based on how many loops their kite formed while rising. An elaborate superstitious system evolved, part science, part whimsy, recorded in charcoal on the underside of a stone bench nearby. Wind from the west. Speak your truth. Wind from the east. Keep your secret. If your kite casts no shadow at noon, your crush will soon smile at you. Charming, entirely unreliable, completely beloved. You glance up at the sky, clear now, save for one lonely feather drifting down. No kites today, but the air still holds the hush of possibility, the sense that if you found a little reed, some old cloth, and a long enough string, the wind might remember how to lift your dreams again. The wind from the kite court follows you into a narrow stone corridor, cooler here, where the sun barely touches the flagstones. You walk past shelves carved directly into the wall, and on one of them rests a cluster of small, lumpy figures arranged in a circle, frozen mid-gesture. Some are kneeling, some are laughing. One appears to be scolding another with a raised hand and no mouth. These aren't idols or dolls. These are puppet folk, part of a forgotten tradition of Damascus's miniature theater. Marionettes and finger puppets flourish quietly in the private quarters of medieval homes, not in grand theaters, but in bedrooms, garden alcoves, and courtyards after supper, especially during long winters or the fasting nights of Ramadan. Puppet shows offered families a blend of entertainment and subtle teaching, equal parts laughter and lesson. The puppets were made from whatever lay at hand: fig wood, cloth scraps, palm leaves, waxed leather, and even bread dough hardened near a fire. Their faces were painted with soot or dye. Sometimes, eyes were pressed in using date bits. The more elaborate ones had hinged arms or finger loops, though most were fixed and relied on clever storytelling to animate them. You pick up one now small, walnut brown, and chipped, Its eyes are to dots. Its smile, faint and crooked, is carved just enough to suggest mischief. Perhaps it once played a trickster, a favorite character in many home puppet shows. Stories performed with these figures often mirrored adult dramas. The merchant who was too greedy, the judge who fell asleep on duty, the matchmaker who promised too much. But there were also fantastical tales riding birds, whispering pots, enchanted bread ovens. Some shows gently mocked local figures, cloaking satire and childlike wonder. And then there were the private puppet tales, told in girls' chambers. Secret love stories acted out behind a veil of linen, starring characters named only the princess and the one who waited. These stories weren't written down, but they lived in whispers, performed after sisters and cousins pretended to sleep. One source, an elderly textile merchant's diary, mentions catching his daughter performing such a play with her cousins. As the audience and candles flickering at their feet, he recalls the final line, spoken by a puppet bride. "I stitched my veil from his shadow." The merchant admitted he didn't understand the ending, but remember the silence that followed. Historians are still divided on whether puppet storytelling among children was encouraged or merely tolerated. Some argue that these performances served as rehearsal for public speaking or storytelling. Others suspect they were quietly subversive spaces where children could parody authority, question arranged marriage, or experiment with dreams otherwise out of reach. Indeed, some puppet troupes were famous beyond the household. A few well-known storytellers made puppet shows in the South for coins, using miniature stages draped in embroidered cloth. But the ones you're standing before now were not for crowds. These were deeply personal, carried in baskets, cradled between pillows, sometimes buried beside their creators. You pick up a tiny wooden dog, cruelly carved with long ears and a curled tail. It likely belonged to a comic puppet tale. In one such play, The Dog Who Married a Merchant's Daughter, the animal's loyalty outshone the suitors, and he was rewarded with a cushion of silk and his own dish at the wedding feast. Utterly ridiculous, deeply beloved. There's also a palm-sized puppet with a crown drawn in faded yellow dye, a queen, a goddess, or just someone important in a child's world. One curious tale recorded only in oral tradition tells of the puppet without a mouth, a figure passed between children who had taken an oath not to gossip. She served as a reminder, speak only what you wish to be remembered by. In some households, she was placed by the door to silently watch those who came and went, a mute guardian. You lean closer to the shelf and find something unexpected, a scroll. Just 3 lines written in curling script. My puppet is named Hilma. She lives in a shoe. She has never forgiven her sister. Strange, vague, completely fascinating. Puppetry, after all, wasn't just a toy, it was catharsis. Children often explored grief through these figures. When a sibling left for war, or a grandparent passed, they'd stage scenes of reunion, comfort, or more surprisingly, justice. In one well-documented case, a boy performed a play in which death arrives in the form of a chicken, steals the grandmother, then returns a year later disguised as a loaf of bread. The child ended the story with the family forgiving death because the bread was warm. It sounds absurd. It also sounds true. Even puppet stages varied in form, some built from old chests turned sideways. Others formed with curtains pinned to standing chairs. More elaborate versions involve painted backdrops, blue skies, minarets, or the curved frame of an imagined palace. Children would often copy what they saw in adult plays but remix it with their own concerns. Missing sweets, rival friends, or a pigeon that refuses to deliver its message. And away. The puppet shows were Damascus's first bedtime podcasts. Voices modulated, characters invented, small wooden figures carrying enormous emotion. They weren't always happy stories, but they were told with love, and often with laughter. You set down the figure and look across the room, where shadow puppets hang from a thin rope, goat shapes cut from translucent parchment, pierced with patterns. When held against a lamp, they cast dazzling shapes on the wall, Some had jointed legs. Others swayed unnaturally, their strings tangled from too many plays and not enough hands to smooth them. One still has its name scratched faintly on its side. Rami. Was it the puppet's name? Or its maker? A curtain rod leans nearby, the cloth still attached. You step behind it, and for a moment, you see what the puppet would have seen: rows of expectant pillows. Cousins sitting cross-legged, a big sister mouthing the words just behind. The sheet, the play is over now, but the silence feels charged, as if the stories haven't truly ended, just paused, waiting for the right fingers to bring them back to life. You step gently out of the puppet alcove and back into the light, where the sun now leans low across the rooftops. The sky turns the milky apricot hue the Damascus wears just before dusk, and as the light mellows, your path winds into a space quieter than the rest, a courtyard garden whose mosaic floor is ringed with warm benches, shaded by a single, sprawling olive tree. Here, the air carries the faintest scent of ink, date syrup, and polished horn. In the center, on a low table of pale stone, sit the smooth ivory tiles. One bears a swirling dot pattern, the other shows a lion, fangs bared, though softened by time. You've arrived in the circle of storied dice, the city's beloved but often overlooked toy of imagination and chance. Damascene children in the medieval era didn't only tell stories through puppets or poetry. Sometimes they left the tale to fate. Storied dice called nik al-hikaya were hand-carved cubes or tiles etched with symbols, animals, or abstract shapes. Each combination carried the seed of a narrative, an opening, a twist, a hero's choice, or a fateful end. Unlike gaming dice used in strategy or gambling, these were specifically for storytelling. They weren't thrown to win, but to begin. The game, if one can call it that, was a communal ritual of invention. Someone rolled the dice, and the group took turns building the story one sentence at a time, guided by the symbols shown. You pick up one ivory die, warm from the sun. One face shows a moon, another, a cracked jar, a third, a woman's slipper. Already your mind begins to hum with possibilities. Historians debate whether these dice originated from Sufi parables, poetic forms, like the Makam, or the riddling games played during the long evenings of Ramadan. What's clear is that they were deeply tied to the Damascene love of narrative, a passion so widespread it spilled from coffee houses into cradles. Children carved their own dice from soapstone or fired clay, often using hairpins or sharpened date pits. The symbols were endlessly varied: eyes, cats, rain clouds, hands with raised fingers, keys, lamps, sandals, swords, figs, fish. Some even bore abstract marks, dots, and spirals or zigzag lines meant to suggest emotion rather than object. A child would declare, "This means a forgotten feeling," and no one argued. One preserved example in a private family archive includes symbols for silence, jealousy, and a locked room. Others are more comedic: sour yogurt, a goat with secrets, a slipper lost at a party. These story dice became fixtures of social play. Families brought them out during visits. Mothers used them to soothe quarrels between siblings, and on at least one occasion, a merchant is said to have used them to propose marriage, spinning a tale from the dice that ended conveniently with a wedding under fig trees. Some scholars argue that story dice were also tools of moral teaching. The child would roll, and the adult would shape the result into a lesson. The snake and the candle. You see, warmth can be dangerous, but among children alone, the stories could veer wildly into the ridiculous, the romantic, or the oddly philosophical. One transcribed tale from a preserved schoolbook tells the story of a girl who traded her shadow for a boat made of mirrors. Another begins with a lion losing its roar and ends with a date pit falling in love with a spoon. All from 2 or 3 dice and a room full of giggles. There's a theory entirely speculative, but irresistible, that some of these dice were coded to create love stories. A particular combination of dove, slipper, and closed door. When rolled by 2 children who liked each other, was believed to predict a future marriage. These myths, likely created by the children themselves, added a quiet magic to every toss. In your hand now is a tile made from horn, smooth as river stone. One side shows an eye, the other a pair of sandals. A final face bears the faintest etching of a jug pouring water. You can't help yourself. You roll it gently onto the floor. It lands with a soft tap. Water, sandals, you smile. You imagine the voice of a small boy saying, "There once was a blind traveler who could only see his dreams when his feet were wet," and a girl adding, "But he only dreamt of the girl who stole his shoes." Then someone else, she returned. Then one at a time, each time she forgave him for something, a whole tale, spinning out like thread from three symbols. There's something oddly intimate about these dice. They aren't for winning. They're for inviting someone into your thoughts, your images, your laughter. Children would pass the dice like gossip, hoping to land on their favorite starting image. Some dice were even customized for certain moods: sad day dice, troublemaker dice, or sleep dice, meant to generate bedtime stories that trailed off into dreams. One girl reportedly carried her lucky tile everywhere, a clay die marked only with an eye and a teardrop. She called it the truth die. No matter the role, her stories ended with something being revealed. And even today, in some homes in Damascus, a handful of these relics remain in drawers or boxes, waiting. Adults say they're for decoration, but once in a while, if the electricity flickers or the power goes out, you might hear the quiet click of bone on stone and the soft, familiar question, "What story shall we tell tonight?" You gather the scattered tiles and gently arrange them back into a circle. Their symbols catch the last golden rays of the afternoon light. You can almost hear the voices of children long gone, taking turns, one line at a time. The echo of imagined tales follows you as you cross into the next courtyard. This one bordered with fragrant lemon trees and overlooked by narrow balconies, their lattice windows half open as if still listening. Here, in the quiet hush between late afternoon and early evening, you come upon a strange sight. 3 long wooden planks set into the ground like narrow runways, and beside them, a cluster of clay spheres, each no larger than a pomegranate. You've reached the racing alleys, where children once played a game of miniature bowling, marble racing, and gentle sabotage all rolled into one. This forgotten game, known by several names, including Madrajat al-Hayar or the Stone Slides, was both a contest of skill and a spectacle of delight. Children would carve grooves into dry-packed dirt or polished stone, then roll clay or wooden balls down them, competing to reach a mark or to strike a target set at the end. The rules shifted from household to household, sometimes invented on the spot, but the energy was always the same: laughter, rivalry, and the occasional shriek when someone's perfect run was ruined by an ill-timed pebble. You stoop to examine one of the balls. Its surface dimpled from use. A small star is etched into one side, and someone has added a smudge of what may once have been blue paint. These balls were precious, often personalized with symbols, names, or charms. Some children carried them in cloth pouches at their belts, ready to race at a moment's notice. But this was more than just rolling things down a slope. In Damascus, as in many places, children had a talent for layering meaning atop the simplest objects. A ball that rolled fastest without touching the sides was said to bring luck. One that stopped too early, a sign that you should be cautious. And love. Yes, even here, love slipped into play. Girls were known to challenge boys to races with flirtatious stakes. "If mine beats yours, you must tell me your favorite color." Or, "If you win, I'll sing you a secret song." These tiny exchanges, barely scandalous, barely noticed, gave children their first taste of risk that wasn't about toys or sweets, but the more thrilling gamble of being seen. One preserved letter between cousins references such a game. "You cheated with your heel, but I forgive you. The ball stopped at my name anyway." Historians still puzzle over whether this pastime was purely child-made or adapted from adult games of chance. The presence of score carvings near old tiles suggests long-running rivalries. In one neighborhood, children kept a leaderboard etched into the back wall of a bathhouse, updating it in charcoal after every match. No prizes, just glory and sabotage was part of the fun. Children might toss small pebbles into the grooves, subtly change the slope of the heel, or distract rivals with sudden jokes or mid-roll questions like, "Would you rather kiss a frog or lose your slippers in the soup?" Games were rarely just games. They were training in attention, wit, and diplomacy. You notice a curved stick resting beside the lanes. These were often used to gently nudge a ball back on course. A gesture allowed once per round, but only if the player sang a line of poetry first. No song, no touch. One rulebook of sorts written by a boy named Sammy. In the margin of his math notes includes favorites like, "The ball is a heart. The path is fate. Let my hand be kind, not late. Charming, no, nearby." A pile of flat stones suggests a variant of the game where targets were stacked like towers. At the end of the groove, knock them all down. You win the round. Miss entirely? You must perform a forfeit, anything from reciting a tongue twister to reenacting the worst scolding you ever received. Some children got quite theatrical, mimicking their aunt's dramatic sighs or imitating their father's exaggerated coughs. Before lecture, one boy, infamous in his alley, would do impressions of animals being told bedtime stories. He once performed a full routine, a goat asking for one more tail, a sleepy donkey refusing to brush his teeth, and a rooster who thought he was a scholar. He lost every round but was never out of favor. There were also tournaments informal, of course held during festival weeks or at the start of spring. Neighborhood champions might be chosen, usually after multiple dramatic rematches and loudly declared rules like, "That ball doesn't count. It touched the cat." You smile at the thought of it, so much pride wrapped around a streak of clay rolling through dust. And still, the racing alleys held softer moments. Some girls would trace their wishes into the grooves before each race, believing that if the ball passed over their name without stalling, the wish would come true. Others placed tiny paddles along the edges, whispering prayers not to win, but simply to feel seen. There's a worn plank with writing barely legible now, but if you tilt your head, you can just make it out. If it rolls past your name, it means you were brave. Not victory, not luck, just bravery, that elusive, quiet sort, the kind you need not to win, but to try. You take one of the clay balls and set it gently in the groove. It rolls, wobbles, slows, and stops just before the engraved star near the end. Not perfect, not glorious, but lovely in its imperfection. Some toys are like that, reminding you that speed isn't everything, that sometimes it's the strange curve, the unexpected halt, the shared laughter when things don't go quite right that becomes the memory worth keeping. The courtyard settles again. You place the ball back with care. Somewhere in the dust, a dozen childhood bets and secrets still hum beneath the surface. The sun dips lower, casting long gold shadows across the courtyard stones. You rise from the racing alleys and follow a winding path into a quieter part of the quarter, a place with fewer trees, more silence, and a curious smell of lavender and old parchment. A narrow stairwell leads you down, not into darkness, but into coolness, and when your eyes adjust, you find yourself in a chamber lined with narrow shelves and delicate niches, each holding something strange and wonderful. Welcome to the Whisper Cabinet, the home of what might be Damascus's most peculiar toy of all, the secret sound bottle. It seems odd to be true, but here, in the shaded basements of certain Damascene homes, children once collected and traded bottles of sounds. No, not literal recordings, they had none, but rather symbolic vessels filled with what they claimed were captured noises. The bottles were stoppered with wax or wrapped in silk, and each was lovingly labeled with whatever sound it was meant to contain. You see one now small, green glassed, no bigger than a thumb. A tag tied to his neck reads, "My cousin's laugh." When he won at chess, Another bears a tiny paper note pressed against the inside. Rain on the roof during Eid. At first glance, you might think it a child's joke, a pretend game spawned from idle minds. But the more you look, the more of these bottles you see. Hundreds, maybe, each tucked carefully into its own cubby. Some shaped like teardrops, others wide and squat, made from ceramic or softened animal horn. These were called zujajat al-hamasis, bottles of affection or bottles of longing. Children would blow gently into them, seal them, and claim the sound was now kept inside. They believed, perhaps sincerely, that on quiet nights, if you uncorked one slowly and held it near your cheek, you could hear the moment again. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was ritual. The bottles became tokens of memory, gifts, trophies, even apologies. One boy gave a girl a bottle labeled "The Moment I Almost Told You." Another child buried one beside a fig tree with a note, "When the doves return, please come back too." The whisper cabinet was where these were stored, at least in this quarter. Some homes had their own versions. Others kept them in drawers, wrapped in handkerchiefs. But this place, this was a shrine. Historians still debate whether the practice began with children or whether it was adapted from an older tradition. Some link it to a Sufi belief in nafas, the breath, as a container of meaning. Others see echoes of it in ancient Egyptian stelae, where prayers were whispered to divine statues in the hope of being heard. But for the children of Damascus, the bottles were simpler, pieces of time they weren't ready to let go of. And some bottles had more mischievous intentions. You find one shaped like a tiny lamp, and the tag reads, "The fart my brother denied." Another claims to hold the way my aunt says no when she means yes. These were part of a different tradition, the playful bottle wars, where children would try to capture the strangest or most embarrassing sound possible, then pass it anonymously to the person who made it. There was even a game. If someone handed you a bottle and you laughed before opening it, you had to tell a secret. If you opened it and claimed to hear nothing, the bottle claimed your voice for a day, and you were forbidden from speaking unless asked a question. Highly illogical, deeply effective. One fragile bottle, tucked behind the silk cloth, bears no tag, just a small line of verse scratched into the clay. "I caught your silence. I'm keeping it safe." Not all bottles were exchanged. Some were made privately and hidden. A girl might keep one sealed for years, never daring to listen. A boy might open one each year on his birthday, claiming it held the echo of a wish he made when he was small, a kind of emotional time capsule. The older children took it further. Some crafted elaborate rituals around their bottles using moonlight, incense, or special incantations. One teen's journal describes a nighttime ceremony where 6 friends buried bottles under a fig tree, each swearing never to speak the contents aloud. A month later, they returned, dug them up, and opened them in silence. No one ever wrote what they heard, of course. Many grown-ups dismissed the practice as childish nonsense, but even they sometimes indulged it. A few parents created their own bottles as keepsakes. A baby's first laugh, the knock at the door when a beloved returned, the sigh of relief after an illness passed. The jars weren't magic, but they felt like something close. You open one gently. Inside, nothing, of course. Or maybe the softness, a shift in the air, the faintest suggestion of something remembered. It's like touching an echo with your fingertips. One child's letter, preserved in the folds of a puppet stage curtain, reads, "To the person who finds this bottle, please pretend it was a good sound." I don't remember anymore, but I think it mattered. You place the bottle back and run your fingers along the wall, where more bottles wait. Some dusted, some faded, some still bright, as if they were filled just last week. They whisper, not with actual sound, but with a hush of love, mischief, longing, and delight. In a city of marble and moss domes, these were its smallest monuments, not carved in stone, but cradled in glass, not told aloud, but sealed, waiting to be heard. You leave the whisper cabinet with a kind of reverence, Stepping slowly back into the golden air of late afternoon, the light is beginning to tilt, mellowing into bronze. You notice your own footsteps have quieted, as though the ground itself has softened. Ahead, a painted door swings open on faint hinges, revealing a long room lined with woven rugs and embroidered pillows, and in the middle, a low, wooden board smooth, worn, and carved with dozens of grooves and hollows out welcome to the stone sewing board, home to a forgotten game of strategy and storytelling that once rippled across the homes of Damascus. Like a secret code of pebbles and patience, this is Al-Bukhana, cousin of Mancala, but with regional flavors, emotional meanings, and more than a little flirtation folded into its rules. You step toward the board and notice the hollows, small, evenly spaced bowls carved into the surface, their edges smoothed by countless fingers. Each is wide enough to hold a few pebbles, dried seeds, or ceramic beads. Children and sometimes entire families gathered around boards like this after meals, during lazy afternoons, or in the lingering warmth of long nights. The premise was simple: redistribute stones or beads around the hollows in certain patterns, sewing them as you moved and collecting according to rules that changed with the players. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just games of logic. Each move could be imbued with symbolism. A certain pattern might mean I accept your challenge. Another might hint at a secret, I know what you said. In some neighborhoods, a girl dropping a red bead in the middle hollow meant she was offering forgiveness. A white one, she wanted a confession first. The game became a soft battlefield of emotion, a conversation that left no words behind, only the quiet tap of stones and the held breath of glances across the board. You sit down before the game. A small bowl nearby holds the plain pieces, tiny stones, each painted with subtle colors. Some are plain, smooth river pebbles. Others are rough, chipped, or faintly perfumed. One stone is wrapped in a twist of lavender thread. Another bears a chipped golden dot. You get the feeling that every player brought their own pieces, and every piece held a meaning. There's a local legend about two young cousins, Salma and Imran, who refused to speak. After a fierce argument, for weeks, they said nothing. But every evening, they met at the stone board and played, slowly. Across 7 games, their moves shifted, the pattern softened, the tension gave way. And on the final day, Salma used her turn to sew all Imran stones into the center hollow, a gesture known as Shanat al-Qalb, or charging the heart. They smiled. No words, none needed. Historians continue to debate whether al-Bukhana originated in trade routes, borrowed from African and Indian versions of similar games, or whether it emerged independently from early agrarian practices, harvesting, storing, and counting. But what is clear is that by the 12th century, children in Damascus had made the game their own. Some households had ornate boards inlaid with ivory and mother-of-pearl. Others scratched simple hollows into hard-packed dirt. In poorer quarters, children played with date pits and buttons, using chalk to mark temporary game paths on a flat roof. One particularly charming variant was played with dried figs and almonds, edible pieces that could be eaten when captured, much to the delight and chaos of the younger players. And then there was the poetry rule. In certain homes, if a player ended a round with a tie, they had to recite a verse. Not just any verse, but one that matched the mood of the game. Joy, regret, anger, affection. A mother might gently remind the sulking child, if you end in silence, your stone has no soul. You spot a verse carved into the underside of the board in front of you. I placed the stone where you last looked at me. Now every move is your echo. Who wrote it? A child, clearly, but one who had already tasted longing. The rules varied wildly, depending on the quarter or the family. In some neighborhoods, a full capture allowed you to ask the other player a personal question. In others, winning 3 games in a row meant you could challenge your opponent to reveal something hidden in their pocket or bag. One infamous game between teenage rivals lasted for nights and reportedly ended when the losing Boy offered his favorite pebble as tribute along, with a folded note reading, "You win everything, even the parts of me I didn't wager." There are whispers of a romantic tradition, too. Some girls made a custom of offering their favorite stone often wrapped in cloth, or scented with rose water as a sort of love token after a final game. To keep the stone was to accept. To return it wrapped in silk was a gentle refusal. To keep it and later drop it back into play during a rematch, that meant not yet. It's not hard to see how a toy became a language adults sometimes played. 2. A few households even held intergenerational matches, parents against children, grandparents coaching, aunties correcting, and everyone insisting their version of the rules was the oldest and most correct. But mostly, it belonged to the children. And even now, centuries later, you can almost hear the faint clack of stones, the slow breath held before a bold move, the ripple of laughter after an unexpected capture. It's all still here, woven into the grooves, tucked into the wear of the board like rain and stone. You pick up one of the painted pebbles. It's red, chipped at one edge, and smells faintly of jasmine. You place it gently into the first hollow, and imagine, for just a moment, that someone across from you mirrors your move. A conversation begins, wordless, ancient, sweet. You rise from the stone-sewing board with a kind of wistful calm, the memory of imaginary games lingering on your fingertips like the traces of distant voices. The path ahead narrows, the tiles grow warmer underfoot, and the walls begin to close. And not in a suffocating way, but like a whisper leaning closer. You pass beneath an arched doorway carved with fig leaves and spirals, and enter a tiled room bathed in twilight blue shadow. In the center, a low marble basin, long since dry, sits surrounded by small benches. On each, delicate trays bear painted pieces, little animals, small folded tiles, cutouts in the shape of hands, spoons, birds, and boats. You've arrived at the guessing fountain, a place for riddles, memory games, and the subtle art of mind reading through toys. This wasn't a fountain for water, but for imagination. In homes with enough room, and sometimes even in Hammam courtyards, after hours children would arrange toy puzzles and mystery objects around a dry basin, then challenge one another with silent clues. The game had no name everyone agreed upon, but among children it was often called Mamba Al Roll, the Fountain of Shadows. The rules were delightfully loose. One child would choose an object, close their eyes, and another would hide it beneath a cloth, alter it subtly, or switch it with something similar. The first player, eyes still closed, had to ask questions yes or no. Vague or poetic hand tried to uncover what had changed or disappeared. It was a game of attention and intuition, of looking without seeing and sensing without proof, one surviving. No book from the 13th century offers a window into these riddles. I held a cat, but now it has wings. I smelled bread, but it was a rose. What have you taken from me? Children didn't just test their memory. They tested their ability to read each other's intentions, to guess what their friends might hide, what they might pretend, or what they might never dare to reveal unless disguised. Many of the objects used were handmade. Paper cutouts painted in vegetable dye, molded wax figures, or flat tiles baked from flour paste and etched with charcoal. Some were tokens from other games, repurposed here. A broken spoon with a name carved into the handle, a wooden beetle missing one leg, a wax bird that melted to near the brazier and now resembled something else entirely. And then there were the folded papers. Children love crafting small puzzles from parchment, sometimes origami-like creatures, other times unfolding riddles, written in code. The guessing fountain was where secrets came to be gently discovered, unwrapped, teased out of silence. In one popular variation, a player would whisper a phrase into a folded cone of paper, seal it with a pinch of flour, paste, and set it inside the fountain's basin. The other players, without opening it, had to guess the message based only on the object's shape, color, or scent. One girl became infamous for using perfume to hint at her riddles. If the scroll smelled of myrrh, it was likely about sorrow. If It smelled of cardamom. The riddle would be flirtatious, rosewater, a secret apology. Her riddles were rarely guessed correctly, but her game always drew a crowd. Historians still wonder whether this practice descended from adult parlor games, or whether it was entirely invented by the children themselves. There are even records of teenage versions of the game that incorporated courtship rituals. In one version, a folded tile would be passed around the basin, each player adding a line of a poem or a single word describing the hidden object. The final player would unfold it and speak what they believed the object to be, along with what it meant. If they guessed correctly, they earned a compliment. If not, they had to offer a secret from their dreams. Yes, even here, the dreaming crept in. Many objects were dream-inspired or crafted after nightmares: thorns that turned into birds, spoons with teeth, cloaked animals with no eyes. One boy swore he dreamed of a lion who whispered riddles and left footprints that glowed. He recreated the lion from clay and brought it to the guessing fountain. It became a tradition to hide it somewhere in the game each week. Whoever found it was keeper of riddles until the next session. And the lion had rules. You couldn't ask a direct question. You had to pose your inquiry in rhyme, or else. The lion would not answer. I saw a foot that walked with none. I heard a bell where there was none. What have you taken from the stone? The answer, of course, was the scent of lemon left behind on a doll's cheek. It didn't always make sense. That wasn't the point. The game was about building a world where memory met mischief, where silence wasn't emptiness but invitation. The toys, once removed from the guessing basin, became storytelling relics in their own right. Some children kept journals of their best riddles. One preserved page includes this entry: "Today I made Marianne believe her spoon could hear lies. She kept it under her pillow. I'm sorry, a little, notably." The guessing fountain was one of the few games that seemed equally cherished by boys and girls. There was no sense of ownership, only the joy of testing one another's minds. And in moments of grief or tension, it became a place to quietly reconnect. One surviving memory, passed through oral history, tells of two siblings who stopped speaking after their mother's death. For months, they avoided one another until the younger left a small carved heart in the basin, hidden beneath a folded paper with one word, "still." The older brother guessed wrong, again and again, until finally he whispered, "Are you still here?" And she nodded. Sometimes the toy wasn't for play. It was for return. Now, as you sit before the dry basin, you spot one last object, a tiny box carved from walnut wood. You lift the lid and find a small pebble wrapped in linen and tied with thread. Inside the fold, written in faded ink, are four simple words: "I guessed you first." You tuck the folded linen gently back into the wooden box and rise once more. The room behind you holds its breath as you step away, as though the riddles are waiting for someone else, now another curious mind to come along and wonder. Out in the corridor, the blue aura is beginning. Light from the narrow windows grows softer, tinged with violet. Somewhere nearby, a pigeon calls once, then falls silent. You follow the mosaic path to a quiet chamber that opens wide onto the sky. No ceiling above, only a stretch of soft indigo and a scattering of early stars. This is the courtyard of threads, where children once played with not strings, not quite dolls, not quite games, but something woven, whispered, and worn close to the skin. Before you now is a shallow basket filled with long, delicate cords, some silk, others wool, a few braided with metallic threads. They've faded over time, but you can still see hints of their original colors: sky blue, crimson, plum, and gold. Tied along each string are knots, loops, and tiny charms, bits of carved wood, painted beads, or curled leaves pressed flat like coins. These are Fibel al-Dikr memory cords, or as children called them, whisper ropes. Unlike the more formal crafts of embroidery or weaving, knot string toys were deeply personal. Each one was crafted by its wearer, added to slowly over time. A new knot might mark a favorite festival, a beloved relative's visit, or even a promise made to oneself. Some knots were tied after dreams, others to bind away fear. You lift one carefully. The string is thin and slightly frayed, but still sturdy. 6 knots near one end are dyed in alternating colors: blue, red, blue. Red end between them hangs a small brass fish, a drop of green glass, and a coiled thread of silk. You run your fingers over the knots, and though they say nothing, you feel the presence of someone's quiet determination to remember. The tradition of knot strings wasn't exclusive to Damascus. Versions of it appeared along trade routes, stretching into Persia and even toward Byzantine lands. But here, it took on a distinctly storytelling role. Children used these cords not just to remember, but to retell. Each knot held a story, and the wearer was the only one who knew them all. One girl's cord, now preserved in a private collection, had precisely 43 knots. Some were enormous and layered with ribbon, others tight and hidden beneath tiny glass beads. She called it her rope of days, and when asked by friends to explain one of the knots, she'd smile slyly and say, "Not yet, you'll have." To earn that story, in some cases, the cords doubled as friendship gifts. A child might begin a string alone, then offer it to someone dear, inviting them to tie the next knot and add a charm. Slowly, a single strand could carry the fingerprints of a dozen hands. One surviving example has charms clearly made from broken toys, a puppet's ear, a marble half melted in the sun, a scrap of a game tile. Historians are still uncertain whether knot strings were purely decorative or carried magical beliefs. Some argue the cords were meant to trap memories like flies in amber. Others claim they were worn to prevent forgetting, especially after something painful, a lost pet, a missed opportunity, an unanswered question. One recovered scroll from a household near Bab Sharkey describes a custom where, after an argument between friends, both parties would tie a white knot at the base of their cords. The knots had to remain untouched for 7 days. On the 8th, they'd meet and try to guess the story behind each other's new knots. If they guessed right, the knot could be untied, and the friendship repaired. It's uncertain whether this ritual always worked, but it was tried. Often, you pick up another cord, this one stiffer, dyed the deep brown of henna. It has no charms, only knots, for near one end are shaped like little loops, perfect circles. The 5th is larger, like a fist. A child's note is tucked beside it. The first 4 were when she stayed. The 5th was when she didn't. Some cords were known as dream ropes. Children would sleep with them under their pillows, hoping their dreams would tangle into the knots and stay. Others were sun ropes, only tied on days when the sun touched the top of a certain rooftop. The ritual might sound odd, but children are experts at making sense of invisible rules. There were even cording cords. When words failed or were too dangerous, some young people wove meaning into knots. A shared string might pass between windows or across garden walls. 3 knots could mean, "I'm thinking of you." 5 meant, "I hope you're thinking of me." A knot wrapped in gold thread. That was harder to interpret. Perhaps that was the point. One rare story tells of a boy who sent a cord to a girl he admired, each knot paired with a line of verse. Her response came weeks later, just a single knot, tied so tightly it couldn't be undone. He kept it anyway. Children also wore these strings like talismans, wrapped around wrists, ankles, necks, or tied into their hair. One old woman remembered having to untie her daughter's memory cord before bathing her, lest the stories dissolve in water. The game of cords became especially poignant in times of change, before journeys, during illness, or after someone moved away. One group of friends reportedly tied their strings together before a cousin left for Aleppo, then cut them apart and wore the frayed ends as reminders. Even today, some elders recall keeping a single knot from childhood tucked away in an old sewing box or drawer. They may not remember the story, but they remember that it mattered. You loop one cord softly around your fingers. It doesn't speak, It doesn't shine, but it holds something weightless, invisible, precious, not a toy in the modern sense, not something bought or sold, but something made in the small moments, in the quiet triumphs and sorrows of growing up. As you set the cord back into the basket, the courtyard seems to exhale. Overhead, a single star twinkles. Perhaps it, too, is tied to a story. The sky overhead has grown deeper now, an indigo velvet flecked with stars. Their light just strong enough to outline the rooftops and spill faintly across the old stones at your feet. You leave the courtyard of threads behind, passing through a narrow archway wrapped in climbing jasmine, its scent blooming stronger as night settles in. Beyond, a flicker of candlelight draws your attention, and there, tucked beneath a canopy of hanging linens and silken veils, you find what seems at first to be a small stage, but not for plays nor puppets. It's a fashion court, a place where children once enacted elaborate dramas through paper dolls and whispered gowns. In the heart of medieval Damascus, where embroidery was an art form and cloth flowed through the markets like water, children made toys not just to play but to dress, to design, to imagine lives of splendor, scandal, and quiet rebellion stitched in the folds of paper and lace. You kneel before the remnants of such a game, delicate silhouettes cut from parchment or thin bark, their edges curled with age. They lie in a circle, arranged like court ladies in council. Their gowns are layered, some dyed with berry juice. Others scrape with charcoal to create patterns like feathers or moons. This was no idle pastime. These were Kukar al-Malabis, palaces of dressing, whole kingdoms of imagination constructed from toy-sized fashions and the stories they carried. And the dolls, often shaped like goddesses, queens, or entirely invented women with names like Sit al-Zayt, Lady of Oil, or Tufawa al-Kalam, apple of speech. Children fashioned them from whatever was at hand, parchment scraps, stiff cloth, palm leaves, or the pressed rind of dried fruits. And then they'd create gowns, robes, veils, and accessories from even humbler materials, flower petals, ribbons, thread from worn tunics, and leftover dye powders from their parents' workshops. But the play was never just about looks. The dolls had lives. One child might narrate the daily trials of her character, a merchant's daughter who pretended to be a prince. Another invented love triangles, betrayal by a silk thief, or a scandal involving a stolen slipper and a perfume bottle with someone else's name on it. Fashion, in this game, became both costume and confession. A popular tradition involved a night of 7 outfits. Over the course of one evening, usually during holidays or a family gathering, children would unveil 7 tiny garments for their dolls, with each change. They had to tell a new part of the story. The final gown always revealed something surprising, a hidden identity, a forbidden love, a long-lost sibling disguised as a servant. Some versions ended with a veil reveal, where the final outfit included a gauzy scrap over the doll's face. Only then would the other players guess who the doll had truly been the entire game. It was often someone else's character in disguise. Historians continue to wonder whether these toys were directly influenced by adult storytelling, or whether they filtered in from bridal customs, harem fashion, or perhaps women's poetry gatherings. But in any case, the children used fashion not to imitate, but to subvert. In one documented case, a group of girls played a week-long game in which none of their dolls wore dresses, only turbans and scholar robes. Their kingdom was a library, and their ruler was a woman who refused to marry because she claimed her heart had already been borrowed by a book. Whether that was satire, aspiration, or just delicious mischief, we may never know. There were romantic elements, too always euphemistic, always softened by laughter. One popular storyline involved a doll who wore perfume so powerful it made everyone fall slightly in love with her, even camels. Another told of a doll whose gown was made from fig leaves and who could only be kissed if the leaves turned gold at sunset. The game usually ended before anyone figured out how that might happen, but it hardly mattered. Boys participated as well. though often by crafting elaborate backstories for tailors, spies, or rival designers. Some took great pride in creating hats or belts for the dolls, while others were known for narrating complex trial scenes, where dolls defended their fashion choices before a pretend court. One neighborhood even held a mock festival each spring, a doll wedding, complete with tiny invitations, a ceremony under a fig tree, and a gown stitched from scraps of a real bride's veil. The guest dolls all were posed on benches of stacked books, and the children played music with date-pit drums and flutes carved from reeds. The bride doll was always veiled until the final moment, and in a twist of charming ritual, one child each year would be blindfolded and asked to bless the marriage by naming a secret wish out loud. That wish was then sewn into a seam of the wedding gown, never to be spoken again. You examine one of the dolls now. Her arms are painted with henna patterns, her robe fastened with a bead no larger than a lentil. A note is tied to her wrist. Her name is Sappha. She wants to be a cloud. These weren't mere decorations. They were mirrors reflecting the thoughts and moods of their makers. One corded doll is wrapped entirely in string, with a slit for the eyes and a single gold thread as a belt. Her name written beneath her feet. She sees everything but speaks only in song. Not all dolls were beautiful. Some were purposefully ugly, draped in scraps or painted with smudged charcoal. Children used them as villains, tricksters, or lost souls. But even those had arc stories of redemption, of transformation, of finally being given a clean gown by a friend's doll who believed in her. It was fashion as narrative, sewing as storytelling, fabric as fate. You tuck the dolls gently back beneath their silken canopy. The candlelight wavers somewhere outside. A fountain trickles faintly. You imagine a group of children around this little palace of fabric and whispers, their voices rising and falling like poetry, their hands tracing gowns into myth. And maybe, just maybe, one of those dolls still wears a ribbon from that forgotten night of laughter beneath the jasmine stars. The canopy of silk and paper dolls fades behind you, and you follow a winding corridor deeper into the night, guided now only by soft lantern glow and the gentle hush of air moving through old stones. You emerge into a new space, not a room, not quite a garden either, but a kind of covered alley between walls, where light filters through patterned grates above. Here, tucked beside baskets of straw, clay jars, and forgotten sacks, you stumble upon one of the most curiously humble toys of all, the Echo Kona game of voices, secrets, and the strange thrill of speaking into nothing and hoping something speaks back. Children called it Kabakaukat, the plate of sound, though it wasn't a plate at all. These toys took the form of narrow funnels or conical tubes made from coiled reeds, thick cloth wound in waxed thread, or, in wealthier households, glazed pottery. At their most basic, they were just rolled paper or stitched leather scraps, but their purpose, to catch a voice and give it shape. You lift one now, a soft cone of dried goat leather, hardened by time. Its rim is painted with tiny symbols, a fish, a moon, and what might be a pomegranate seed. The base is narrow, meant to fit at the ear, and the wide opening still carries the ghost of a child's breath. This was a toy of performance. Yes, but more than that, a toy of listening. Children used echo cones in games that blended theater, guessing, storytelling, and flirtation. One child would speak into the cone softly, slowly, often from behind a curtain or tiled screen, while another held it to their ear. The voice would distort slightly, made strange by the shape of the cone. If the listener could guess who was speaking or what was being said, they'd win a charm or a dare. But the game had rules. You couldn't use your normal voice. You had to disguise it, make it slow, poetic, musical, or whisper light. Some children invented full echo characters, mysterious personas, that only appeared through the cone. A whisper named Zainab, who only spoke in questions. A poet called Amar, who rhymed every answer. A fox who lied in reverse. One boy became so adept at performing different voices that his friends believed he had a ghost cousin who visited during rainstorms. He never corrected them. Over time, the cones became decorated with symbols thought to change the tone of the voice: spirals for mystery, stars for clarity, stripes for truth. One girl painted a rose on her cone and swore that any message passed through it sounded more sincere. You try one, holding it to your lips and speaking softly. The sound echoes faintly, distorted just enough to feel otherworldly, not unlike the sensation of hearing your own voice underwater. It was also a tool for secrets. Children passed messages through the cone when they couldn't speak openly. I saw what you drew on the fig wall. Don't drink the lemon tea, I put salt in it. If you wear green tomorrow, I'll know it's yes. One preserve cone. Discover behind a kitchen hearth. Bore an inscription inked in careful hand. This voice belongs to no one. Let it say what I cannot. Historians aren't sure when the echo cone first appeared. Some believe it evolved from adult musical instruments, primitive trumpets, or call horns reimagined as toys. Others think it may have come from the ceramic funnels used by perfume vendors, turned sideways into whispers instead of wafts. But in Damascus, it became distinctly its own thing, a private theater in a child's hands. You could speak through it to perform, or to confess, or to ask a question that would be too heavy if said aloud, face to dash face. And yes, sometimes, to flirt. One popular game involved 3 cones and 3 voices. The listener would be blindfolded and asked to guess which voice was which. A right answer earned a poem, a wrong one, a tickle, a riddle, or a dare. Say what you would say if you thought no one knew it was you. The stakes were never high, but the tension, no. The delicious, whispered tension was everything. Even adults got drawn in. Some families used echo cones during storytelling nights, passing them around so that each speaker would deliver their line through the distortion. The result, a tale told in many voices, none of them quite real. Children called it al-kissa al-mumtazaja. The story stirred like tea. There are records of a noblewoman in the early 14th century who kept an entire collection of echo cones, each with a different colored tassel. She was said to let guests choose one before they could join her garden gatherings. If you spoke through a silver cone, you had to speak only truths. If you picked the purple one, everything had to be praise. Red meant romance, green meant mystery, and black meant nothing but riddles. Even more fascinating, some echo cones were paired, 2 tubes, joined by a stretched silk cord, could carry voice from one to another over short distances, window to window, courtyard to rooftop. A crude but charming kind of toy telephone. There's a story, possibly legend, possibly true, of 2 girls who lived in adjacent homes and weren't allowed to speak. After a family disagreement, each night, they'd leave their cones on opposite window sills. At midnight, they'd take turns whispering lullabies or small confessions into the dark. They never saw each other again. But when one of the homes was renovated a century later, workers found the cones still perched there, side by side. You trace the rim of the echo cone one last time and whisper something, nothing important, just your name maybe, or a word you don't often say aloud. You don't need to hear it clearly. The echo is enough, a soft return, a voice coming back to you, not quite the same, but still familiar. That, perhaps, was the true magic of these toys, not the sound itself, but the echo of connection, the act of sending something out and hearing it return, changed, but still yours. The stars are fully out now, gentle and blinking, like distant embers caught in a breeze. You pass beneath a low archway where shadows bloom thicker, the stone still warm beneath your feet. The path slopes downward into a tucked-away courtyard paved in uneven bricks, where vines curl around the frames of shuttered windows and wind sighs through the narrow alleyways. This quiet place was once the setting for a rather unusual game, the scent duel, or as the children of Damascus playfully called it, farbal, ere the perfume wars. You'd be forgiven for imagining luxury, elegance, rows of crystal bottles and gleaming jars. But here, in the children's quarters, perfume was a different matter. This was the world of handmade concoctions: deep petals, crushed herbs, melted wax, soot scraped from lamps and mixed with honey or vinegar. The goal was not to smell beautiful but to surprise, provoke, or, on occasion, charm. The rules of Farbal varied wildly from one alley to the next, but the spirit remained the same. You made a scent potion, and someone had to guess or survive it. You kneel beside a sunken tray still stained with residue of oils and old petals. A reed basket nearby holds dried citrus peels, a small leather pouch of clove dust, and what looks like an old fig paste jar that's been used for something else. Perhaps something with cinnamon, and something very much not cinnamon. In its simplest form, the game involved two players. Each prepared a scent, often in secret, sometimes with help from siblings or neighbors. These concoctions were then presented in tiny clay cups or on bits of fabric. The players would take turns holding the scent to each other's nose, one breath at a time. Then came the challenge. Describe the scent using only metaphor. One child might declare, "This smells like a wedding," interrupted by a sneeze. Another would counter, "This is what it smells like inside a cat's dream after it eats roses." Points were awarded by an audience, usually siblings, for the most creative, unexpected, or emotionally accurate descriptions. But things could escalate. The children, ever inventive, developed rival scent factions. Some were known for creating trick perfumes, startling mixtures designed to evoke confusion, mockery, or mild horror. Rotten melon blended with flower water, crushed mint with pickle brine, soap mixed with saffron and just enough soot to sting the nose but not the eyes. Other factions took the high road, crafting scents of real beauty, night blooming jasmine layered with warm amber oil, or lemon peel steeped in rose water and honey. They were known as the Nakab al-Dahab, gold noses. The two groups often held battles in alleyways or school courtyards. Children would pass the scents along a line, blindfolded, and vote on which team's creation told the better story. But it wasn't just about smell. It was about intention. One girl's signature move involved preparing a scent she described as how it feels to miss someone at dusk. Another child created one he called a lie you almost believed. These weren't scents made for elegance, they were vessels of emotional trickery, and occasionally of romance. Some teens used the game to pass soft, coded messages. A boy might deliver a vial of cedar oil with a whisper, "Guess who I made this for?" A girl might respond with cloves and cinnamon and the line, "I think you already know." Of course, these games remain euphemistic, wrapped in the safety of ambiguity. But when words failed or rules forbade speaking plainly, scent became the carrier of possibility. One particularly poetic tradition involved gifting a scent scroll, a rolled scrap of fabric, infused with layered fragrances. These scrolls had to tell a story entirely through smell. A popular one included 3 sections. The first to suggest innocence, perhaps orange blossom. The second to hint at confusion, maybe vinegar, ink, or pepper. And the third to conclude with resolution, lavender, musk, or sweet fig. The recipient had to describe the emotional arc of the scroll. If they guessed right or offered a better story, the sender owed them a favor or a secret. Historians still debate whether these games developed independently or were influenced by the broader Damascene perfume culture, which was among the most sophisticated in the medieval Islamic world. Merchants imported exotic oils from India, Arabia, and North Africa. Scent played a role in religion, medicine, and courtly rituals. But while the adults used perfume to impress, soothe, or seduce, the children used it to challenge. They challenged each other's senses, each other's creativity, each other's hearts. One girl kept a jar she never let anyone smell. It was known among her friends only as al-Mamnu, the forbidden scent. When asked about it, she'd smile and say, "It smells like the thing I'll never tell." Another game variation required players to walk through a cloud of vaporized scent, made by flicking scented water over hot stones, and describe what it made them remember. Answers ranged from "my grandfather's beard" to "when the peach I stole turned out to be unripe." You lift one of the small cups now and bring it to your nose. The scent is faint, something bitter and warm. You can't place it. Clove, charcoal, or perhaps just the echo of a summer long since folded into dusk nearby. Someone long ago carved into the wall a quiet challenge. Smell this. And remember the person who would understand it best. You close your eyes. That it's not a perfume. Not really. It's a toy, a memory, a dare, a love letter. All of them at once. Dissolved in oil and time. The night is deepened into its softest hush. That velvet stillness between midnight and the first hints of dawn. You leave the perfume wars behind and step into a smaller wing of the courtyard, where the ground is packed dirt and the walls bare. The faded remains of painted vines and geometric shapes. There are no fancy cushions here, no tiles or trays, just old benches, a few overturned baskets, and scraps of wood. You've come to the shadow play corner, a favorite haunt of children with big stories and limited props. Here, in the flicker of lamplight or the blush of fire from a brazier, small hands created entire worlds using nothing more than their fingers, scraps of paper, and the walls themselves. This was the domain of Yad Alkil, the hand of imagination. A game as ancient as storytelling itself. You sit on one of the benches, and already you can see them in your mind, those familiar shapes. A rabbit made with a flick of the wrist. A bird with flapping wings formed by the palms crossing. The dramatic arc of a dragon stitched together by 5 children hiding behind a curtain. Shadow games in medieval Damascus weren't only pastimes, they were performances. And often, they were used to retell tales that children weren't supposed to know or that adults thought they'd forgotten. Not here, behind a lantern or beside a well-lit wall. The shadows became stage actors. The stories, well, that depended on the night. Sometimes they were pure mischief. Goats who outwitted foxes, cats who stole the imam's shoes, or naughty spirits who sneezed the stars into being. Other times, the performances took on deeper toned tragedies, romances, longings disguised in light and flicker. One child would narrate, another would shape the shadows. The rest would sit, transfixed. Some performers created entire shadow casts from paper dolls mounted on sticks. They'd attach them to reeds, thin threads, or lengths of palm fiber, and hide behind woven mats to control them from below. With enough skill, the figures could bow, gesture, or even mimic fighting. The most beloved plays always included at least one ridiculous animal and one noble character whose fate made everyone sigh. And then there were the forbidden plays. These weren't written anywhere, but every child knew them. The tales whispered at dusk, always told with a glance over the shoulder. Stories of love triangles in the hammam, of the old prince who kept losing his slippers on purpose so the maid would find them, of a girl whose shadow fell in love with someone else's. These stories weren't crude or vulgar, they were sweet, strange, and filled with longing, euphemistic, poetic, soft-edged like dreams. One such tale, told entirely in shadows, was The Lantern Bride. It followed a girl made of candlelight who could only speak when no one looked at her. She fell in love with a boy who lived inside a mirror. They could only meet during storms, when reflections disappeared and shadows danced freely. Each scene was performed with a single flame, and to hands no dialogue. Only gestures and one small bell to mark transitions. Another popular show was The Tailor's Mistake, where a lonely tailor stitched a suit so beautiful that he fell in love with it. He gave it a name, spoke to it, fed it, but the suit ran away. The children often improvised the ending. Sometimes the suit returned, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it married someone else entirely. Scholars still debate whether these shadow plays were derivative of the more formal Karg traditions that flourished later in the Ottoman world. But the Damascene versions were smaller, quieter, far more intimate. There was no stage, no curtain, just a child's hand, a lamp, and an audience of 4 or 5 friends. And while adults were often welcome, especially grandparents, who were praised for their long memories, many of the best performances happened after curfew. In tucked away corners like this one child was known only as Almec the lamp. He had a voice that made everyone fall silent and shadows so precise you could swear they blinked. He never showed his face during performances. He'd hide behind a curtain stitched from an old market awning, and no one ever saw how he did it. When he stopped performing, perhaps because he grew up, or moved away, the others left his corner undisturbed for months. Someone wrote on the wall behind his usual lamp, "The lamp still flickers, even when no one's home." Sometimes, the games grew interactive. Children in the audience would be invited to enter the story by placing their own hands in the lantern beam. They'd be asked to become the wind, or a tree, or the wings of the bird who carried the lovers across the river. The joy was in improvisation, in the absurd, in the sudden invention of new rules. And there were rules, of course. You couldn't speak above a whisper during the story. If your shadow overlapped another's, you had to apologize in character. And if your figure fell apart mid-performance, you had to incorporate it into the tale. The hero melted. A narrator might whisper solemnly, but from his shadow, a new bird was born. One recovered list of performance titles scribbled on the back of a pastry receipt includes "The Prince Who Forgot to Dream Why Bread Smells Like Sadness, A Shadow's First Kiss, The Woman Who Laughed at the Moon, The Boy Who Married His Own Reflection." These were not plays in the modern sense. They were rituals of gentle rebellion, ways to explore feelings and questions that had no place at the family table. Why do some people never come back? Why does missing someone smell like rain? Why are the things we want always hiding behind something brighter? You pick up a broken silhouette, now a paper-cut figure of a fox, tail curled into a question mark. The lantern nearby flutters softly, and for a moment, just before you place the figure back on the bench, its shadow stretches across the wall behind you, still whole, still mischievous, still waiting for the next story to find it. The hush has deepened, thick and golden like honey left too long in a warm bowl. You've now wandered far from the more polished corners of the courtyard, where tiles glinted and perfumes lingered. Here, the stones are cracked, the walls undecorated, and the windows too small for sunlight to ever fully enter. It feels like a forgotten passageway, a leftover hallway that the grown-ups ignore perfect. Of course, for a secret game. You step over an old wooden threshold and find yourself surrounded by dust puppets. Yes, dust. Puppets. Perhaps not what you expected, but in a city like Damascus, where dust settled constantly from the desert winds and every household had a broom or three, children didn't just sweep it away. They played with it. The game was called Kuyal al-Guber, Visions of Dust, and it began with something as simple as a clean floor. Or, more precisely, the illusion of one. Children would dampen their palms, rub them over polished stones, and swirl through the fine layer of dust left by time and silence. They'd use their fingers to trace shapes, spirals, snakes, mysterious faces, or winding paths. But the real magic came later, when those shapes came alive. The trick, breathing gently across the dust lines, or waving a piece of cloth near the floor to create a shifting breeze. The figures would move, slowly, subtly, as if woken by whisper. Some kids claimed that dust puppets could only move when no one was looking directly at them. You had to glance sideways, or from the corner of your eye. If you stared too hard, the magic collapsed. You just see smudges, like muddy footprints from an invisible bird. And so the game evolved. Each child would create a character in dust, a wandering trader, a weeping bride, a lopsided dog with too many tails. Then, through careful movements of breath or fan or fluttered sleeve, they would guide the figure across the floor. In slow-motion performance, competitions formed. Who could make their dust puppet travel the farthest? Who could move theirs in a circle without smearing it? Who could create a full love story, courtship, heartbreak, reconciliation without lifting a single finger? But it wasn't just about movement. Each puppet had a voice, and each voice came from someone else in the room. One child moved the dust, another narrated, a third might play background music by humming into a clay jar. It was a form of theater so fragile that any gust of wind, any scurrying foot, any careless breath could end it entirely, which, of course, made it sacred. There was a story about a girl named Hannah who made only one dust puppet her entire childhood. A small crescent-shaped figure she called Kamar, the moon. She never changed it, never moved it. Each day she'd recreate it exactly as before. Her friends asked her why, and she'd always answer, because one day she'll blink. Children believed strange things about these puppets, that they had memories, that they could disappear if they felt disrespected, that if two were placed close enough together, they'd eventually form a bond and begin to shift toward each other during the night. In one family's records preserved in the margin of a prayer journal, there's a description of a dust wedding performed by 5 siblings. The puppets were made with extra care, one traced using honey mixed into the dirt, the other dusted in fine white flour. The ceremony included flower petals, whispered blessings, and a small crumb of cake saved from their aunt's engagement. Party dot the morning after. Both puppets had smeared entirely, but a faint heart shape remained where their outlines had overlapped. Historians still argue about whether Kuyal al-Guber was uniquely Damascene or part of a broader Levantine folk culture. Some trace its lineage to older Sufi practices, where sand drawing and air rituals were used in meditative storytelling. Others think it was simply born of boredom and beauty, a child's way of finding magic in dust. But no matter its origin, the game captured something profound, the idea that impermanence was part of the play. You weren't meant to keep a dust puppet. The joy was in its making and its quiet vanishing. You learned to let go, to laugh when your story was wiped away by a cousin's foot or a stray gust of courtyard wind. The puppet would return tomorrow, or not. That was its choice. And sometimes, children made mourning puppets, figures meant to vanish as a way of saying goodbye. When a pet died, when a family member left for another city, when a favorite tree was cut down, they would gather in a circle and create the shape of whatever had been lost. Then they'd blow gently, one by one, until the figure disappeared completely. There was no applause, just silence, and perhaps a story passed around like a candle. Some puppets were mischievous. They'd hide in doorways or under furniture, waiting for someone to discover them and interpret their story. Others were gifts. A boy might make one for a girl and leave it where he knew she'd sweep. The message was never written, only brushed away with care. You glance down now at the floor around you. Dust still rests there, not thick, but enough. With one fingertip, you trace the simplest figure you can think of: a curved back, 2 ears, a long tail. Perhaps a cat, or perhaps a fox, something sly and playful, and then you breathe gently. For a moment, it seems the tail flutters, not enough to be certain, but enough to imagine. You sit quietly for a long moment, watching it fade. From the chamber of dust puppets, you return to the garden pathways, where cool air now dances through fig leaves and jasmine petals fallen loose from the vines. The wind carries a scent of something earthy, faintly sweet like rain that never fell. The city around you is utterly still. But here in this final curve of the children's world, you enter a space that feels strangely alive. Before you is a circle of stones, each no larger than a child's palm. Some are painted, others etched with symbols, others still left bare. At the center lies a broken dish, flipped upside down like a lid over forgotten treasure. This was not a game of motion or mimicry. This was the circle of stories, a game of pure invention. It was called Dirat al-Kaikait, the story ring, and it was played in the hush of late afternoons, when children were tired from running, or in the fragile hush after the call to prayer, when parents spoke in low voices and shadows stretched long across the tile. The game began with a circle, stones arranged like clock numbers, each standing for a particular theme: love, loss, luck, change, escape, return, rain, silence, a door, a voice, a mistake, a glimpse. A child would sit at the edge and spin atop usually a dried fig, stem sharpened and balanced just so. Wherever it pointed when it stopped, That was the beginning of the tale. You lift the overturned dish now and find beneath it an old, faded circle of paper with handwritten symbols arranged in 12 sections. A sun, a rose, a pair of eyes drawn without pupils. The ink has faded in places, but the shapes are still clear like memories reluctant to fully disappear. Each symbol opened a door. Each door led somewhere only children could describe. The first child to speak would begin with the phrase, "In a place like this one," but not quite, and from there, the story unfolded. One child might spin and land on a voice. They'd tell of a girl who heard someone calling her name from inside a teacup. She drank the tea, and then she could only speak in proverbs. Another might land on rain and recount how the brothers grew trees from puddles. By whispering secrets into the soil, the stories didn't need to make sense. In fact, they were better if they didn't. This wasn't a competition. There were no winners, just wonder. But there were still rules. Each new speaker had to continue the previous tale without repeating any exact phrase. If someone accidentally repeated even a single sentence, they had to leave the circle until they could return with a gift, a poem, a riddle, or a piece of fruit. There was a boy known for his famous poem Penance. The fig splits open like an apology. The seeds are not sorry, but they remember. Another child, more mischievous, returned with a riddle. What sleeps during the sun, blinks when touched, and dreams in oil? It was an olive, at least. That's what she claimed. There were special stones called mirrors that allowed a child to change the story entirely. Only 3 such stones existed in any circle, and you had to close your eyes while touching one. The new tale had to begin with the phrase, "But elsewhere, a different wind was blowing." These wind stories could leap to different characters, places, even times. Sometimes they were romantic, a woman waiting for a message tied to a bird's foot. Other times, philosophical, a baker who burned bread on purpose to find messages in the ash. Or absurd, a shadow that escaped its body and got a job selling spices. The point wasn't coherence, it was connection. The stories were tangled like vines, meandering, contradicting, folding back upon themselves until one child would say, softly, "I think we've returned," and everyone would nod, recognizing without quite knowing how that the circle had closed. One tale, passed down in scraps of notebook margins and whispered lullabies, tells of a girl who fell in love with a mirror, not with her own reflection but with something else living inside it. She could only see him when the mirror fogged up. Her friends tried to help. One gave her a warm fig to breathe upon the glass. Another offered a riddle stone. In the end, she smashed the mirror and found nothing, or perhaps she found freedom. The story never agrees. Historians believe Dirat al-Kakite may have roots in much older oral traditions, Bedouin desert storytelling rings, Sufi parables, or even classical Arab logic puzzles that once tested memory and improvisation. But the children of Damascus took it somewhere more whimsical and more private. Some families even adopted the game into nightly rituals. One mother required her children to tell a story together. Every Friday evening before dessert, she called it sweet before sweet. If the story wasn't good enough, she pretended to hide the pastries. She never really did, but they tried harder. And yes, there were shadowed stories. To romantic whispers and dreamy metaphors only older children dared speak aloud. One such tale, told again and again, began like this: in a house where everyone had forgotten how to kiss, one child remembered the shape of a whisper from there. It wandered to a stolen perfume bottle, to a rainstorm in a dry bathhouse, to a stranger who wore shoes on the wrong feet. The story changed every time but always ended with someone standing alone at dawn, waiting for a voice they no longer remembered. You spin the old top once, for no reason but to hear it rattle. It wobbles, spins, and falls pointing toward a symbol to overlapping eyes. You don't speak, you just smile. Because here, stories don't end. They rest, they linger, They wait for breath, and the circle still waits to begin again. The wind is soft now. Barely, there's just a suggestion of breath moving through leaves. You follow it, not with footsteps but with your gaze. As it passes through the last and most hidden part of the courtyard, you've arrived at the place of leftovers, a small alcove behind an abandoned oven, where broken tiles, warped spoons, bent combs, and other cast-offs lie quietly under a crumbling lattice roof. This is where the city's most improvised toys lived. They weren't carved with care or sewn with silk and thread. They were made from what was forgotten, discarded, or borrowed indefinitely from someone's older sibling. And yet, they might be the most beloved of all. Here, children played a game called If It Were at first glance. It was just storytelling. You pick up an object, a shard of pottery, a frayed shoelace, a spoon with a twisted handle, and say what it might be if it weren't what it obviously was. This bent spoon. It's the tusk of an underground elephant. That torn sandal strap. It's a lock of hair from a desert queen. This broken bowl. It's the shield of the one's child. Each object carried a hidden identity, and part of the game was defending your claim. Other children would try to poke holes in your story. If it's a tusk, where's the rest of the elephant? If it's royal hair, why does it smell like onions? But if you could answer with imagination, or better yet, with feeling, you won the point. And if your story made someone sigh, you won 2 points. One child, legend says, picked up a cracked blue tile and declared it was a teardrop by the moon. When it saw someone dancing alone, everyone went silent. No one challenged her. She didn't even take the point. She just placed it back where she found it and walked away. Another tradition involves stringing several objects together like charms on a bracelet and creating an entire origin myth. A child might hold up a loop of string, a thimble, and a piece of shell and declare, this was the crown of the Whisper Prince. He ruled a city made of wind, but he spoke too loudly, and the buildings blew away. Now he wears silence like a robe. If another child wanted to keep the story going, they had to add their own object and continue. With enough players, the story became a tapestry, silly, beautiful, or quietly heartbreaking. One game stretched over several weeks and culminated in a feast made from imaginary ingredients and cooked over 3 bricks and a shiny spoon. Some children made pocket museums, fabric pouches filled with relics from these games. A flattened coin became a cursed mirror. A broken bracelet clasp was a gate key to an invisible palace. A crushed olive pit was the seed of a forest that only grew under starlight. You reach down now and brush aside some dust. Beneath a bit of woven mat, you find one such relic, a rusted key, small and perfectly ordinary. But tied to it is a faded slip of paper, nearly disintegrated. One word remains: promise. What did it unlock? That was the whole point. It didn't matter. The story was what mattered. The whisper, the breath, the idea that you could find wonder in anything. The game sometimes drifted into the philosophical. One older girl once picked up a piece of melted wax and said, if this were a memory, it would be the one I'm trying not to remember. She won all the points that day. Other times, it turned tender. One child offered a smooth pebble and whispered, if this were a person, it would be my grandmother's laugh. The other children passed it around in silence before tucking it into the pocket museum. No one ever pretended it was anything else again. There were darker turns, too. A broken bracelet might become the token of a lost friend. A spoon might be the last gift from someone who left. These stories were met with quiet nods, and sometimes the storyteller would be left alone for a while, not out of awkwardness, but reverence. Children understood, even when they didn't. Historians who've heard of this game often wonder whether it had adult origins, echoes of Sufi poetry, or perhaps the metaphorical language of old love letters. But others argue that it sprang entirely from the fertile, unguarded world of the child's imagination, where metaphor wasn't just a literary device, it was a survival tool. After all, how else could a child process longing, confusion, that eerie, aching feeling of growing up faster than anyone expected. One small rule remained unspoken. Once you gave an object a story, you could never see it the same way again. That spoon, no longer a spoon. That pebble, someone's grandmother's. Laugh, forever. That key, a promise, still waiting to be kept. And now, in this quiet moment, with the night pressing against the latticed roof and your breath barely stirring the air, you begin to understand what all these toys truly were. Not just games, not just amusements. They were metaphors, puzzles, soft spells of the sleeping world, ways for children to touch mystery and grief and wonder with laughter, with daring, with dust on their knees and a story on their tongue. And even now, as you rise from the place of leftovers and brush off your hands, you glance down at a crooked stick lying by the threshold. If it were anything, you think it might be a finger, pointing towards something beautiful that hasn't happened yet. And now, the dust has settled. The garden is silent, save for the soft creak of wood somewhere far away, and the barely there rustle of leaves brushing against ancient brick. You sit still, just breathing, feeling the lingering presence of tiny laughter, the last flickers of puppet shadows, and the fading perfume of childhood dreams told by lantern light. You've wandered through a city that exists now only in memory, and even then, only in the quiet corners, not the ones in books or grand museums, but in tucked-away courtyards, in broken tiles, in spoon-handled gates, in the pause between one whispered story and the next. It's strange, isn't it, how something so fragile, a toy, a game, a child's sight can survive longer than stone, outlive names, drift forward on wind and bedtime, waiting to be remembered. You're not just drowsing now, you're weighted with warmth, with the soft hush of knowing something small and secret, that in medieval Damascus, joy was an art, that tenderness was practiced in public, that imagination was not a pastime, it was a form of survival. And in a way, perhaps it still is. So let yourself rest now. Let your mind drift among shadows and jasmine. Let the games continue, quietly, in your dreams, where foxes flirt in perfume, battles, where paper dolls dance above rooftops, where echo cones carry the voices you thought you'd forgotten. No more movement now, just a slow breath in and out, a stillness, a flicker, a hush, a story, folding itself closed.